Eleanor Finch had always believed that history was a living thing. Growing up in a quiet Massachusetts town, she spent more time with books than with people. Her dream had been simple: to uncover forgotten truths, to find what the world had overlooked, and to let the past speak again. She had never imagined that one day, history would whisper back. Late one evening, she found herself inside the Eastbourne Special Collections Library, a place that rarely allowed access after dusk. But her research request had been approved for a single night, and she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. The library felt different at night, quieter, heavier, as though time itself slowed down between the shelves. The lamps cast pools of warm light over wooden tables, and the rest of the room dissolved into soft shadows. Eleanor walked toward the restricted section with a clipboard in hand, her boots tapping softly on the stone floor. She knew exactly what she was searching for: a medieval manuscript known only through rumors and two vague citations from the 19th century. Both citations suggested that the manuscript contained the writings of a scribe who had accused a secret medieval brotherhood of manipulating historical events. Scholars had dismissed the reference as apocryphal, unverified, possibly imagined. But Eleanor, who had spent months tracking down leads, felt that the manuscript was real, and if it existed, it would be here. She opened the tall cabinet marked uncatalogued, European 12th, 5th, 10th century. The metal handle was cold, and the hinges groaned softly. Inside lay stacks of leather-bound volumes, all aged different shades of brown and gold. Many had brittle covers, and some had faded lettering so thin that even careful reading struggled to reveal what they once were. Eleanor lifted each manuscript gently, inspecting the edges for seals, markings, or dates. Most were familiar copies of monastic sermons, accounts of land exchanges, letters between minor nobles. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Then her fingers brushed a manuscript that felt colder than the rest. It was wrapped in a dark, nearly black leather cover, tied shut with a thin cord that looked newer than the binding. A faded red wax seal sat in the center knot, the ornate, royal shape she expected from medieval correspondence, but something more obscure. A simple circle with 3 small indentations along the edge, almost like 3 fingertips had pressed into the wax while it was still soft. She had never seen a seal like that. Eleanor lowered the manuscript onto the table and brought the lamp closer. For a moment she simply stared at it, trying to understand why the book made her chest tighten. It was as though the manuscript had weight beyond its physical form, as though it had been waiting for someone to pick it up again after all these centuries. The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the faint hum of the climate system faded. Or maybe Eleanor simply stopped noticing it. She leaned in and felt the slightest chill brush against her ear. For a second, she thought she heard someone whisper. She straightened immediately, her pulse quickening. There was no one else in the room. She had checked twice when she entered. Still, she scanned the space again, the silent shelves, the motionless shadows, the stillness of the air. Nothing moved. Long day, she murmured to herself, trying to shake it off. But when she touched the manuscript again, the whisper returned, so faint that she wasn't too sure if it came from outside her or from deep inside her head. It was not a word she understood. It sounded like breath against parchment. She swallowed hard. This was no ordinary document. Carefully, she broke the wax seal. It snapped cleanly, almost to icily, for something that should have been centuries old. The cord loosened, and the cover opened with a soft sigh, as if releasing air trapped for hundreds of years. The first page was filled with handwriting that belonged unmistakably to the medieval period type. Disciplined strokes, ink darkened with age. But what startled her most was the opening line. For those who seek the truth that was buried, know this. I write in fear of men who walk without faces. Eleanor blinked slowly. If this was authentic, the implications were astonishing. Writers of medieval manuscripts rarely used symbolic language like this unless they feared persecution, and in their words were cryptic, coded, and cautious. She turned the page. The next line read, "History is no longer ours. It has been taken, shaped, corrected." Her breath caught. This was exactly the kind of accusation referenced in the 19th century citations. She felt a rush of excitement, almost enough to eclipse her fear. Almost. She read a little more. If this manuscript survives, let it be known that the Brotherhood of the Veil is not a myth. nor are its methods. They have altered chronicles, silenced scribes, and rewritten the truth of kings. I must finish this before they return. They watch through the eyes of those who do not blink. The handwriting trembled slightly near the end of the sentence, as though the scribe had been rushing or frightened. Eleanor's hands shook as she held the page open. A brotherhood rewriting medieval history. That alone, if proven, would append centuries of accepted scholarship. Entire narratives about kingdoms, crusades, plagues, and politics might be unreliable, but something else bothered her. The manuscript smelled faintly of smoke. Not the musty kind that came from old libraries, but something sharper like a candle extinguished moments ago. Eleanor lowered her face closer to the page. Then the whisper returned, clearer this time, brushing her left ear. She froze. It sounded like someone standing right beside her. The words came softly, almost reverently, though she understood none of them. A language she didn't recognize. A tone that wasn't threatening but carried a warning she could feel more than hear. She turned her head to look at the space beside her, expecting she didn't know what. But there was nothing, only rows of books and the halo of the lamp's light. Her breathing felt too loud in the still room. She closed the manuscript, gently, though not all the way, and placed her hand on the cover as if to reassure herself it was real. The whisper stopped instantly. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She considered the possibilities. She was tired. She had been pushing herself for months. Perhaps the whisper was a product of exhaustion. Perhaps the sensation of cold had been a trick of old leather absorbing the room's temperature. But deep inside, she knew better. This manuscript had been hidden because someone wanted it forgotten. Someone had sealed it, stored it away, and ensured that no catalog recorded its existence. And now, it was in her hands. She reopened the manuscript, more determined. On the last line of the first page, the scribe had written, "To the one who finds these words in a distant age, know that the truth has waited for you." But so have they. Eleanor read the line 3 times, her chest tightening a little more each time. She wasn't sure whether they referred to the faceless men, the Brotherhood of the Veil, or something else entirely. Outside, the library's clock chimed softly 10 o'clock. Eleanor looked up, feeling suddenly as though the sound came from much farther away than it should have. The air felt heavier, as if the library itself acknowledged what she had just opened. She touched the corner of the page and whispered, "What happened to you?" The manuscript remained still, yet she felt an answer forming in the weight of the silence around her. This was the beginning of something far larger than she had anticipated. Something that stretched across centuries and had waited patiently in the dark for someone to uncover it. Eleanor didn't believe in fate, but tonight, sitting alone with a manuscript that spoke of fear, conspiracies, and faceless watchers, she felt the uneasy sense that the past had chosen her. She took a deep breath, slid the manuscript closer, and continued reading. Whatever truth lay hidden here, she would have to face it, and whatever it whispered in her ear, whether memory, imagination, or something impossible, she had a feeling it wouldn't be the last time she heard it, because some shadows, once they awaken it, do not return to silence. Eleanor did not move from her seat for a long time after reading the first page. The manuscript lay open before her, the ink frozen in time, carrying the tremor of someone who had written in fear. She traced her fingertips lightly over the edge of the parchment, careful not to damage the fragile sheet, and her eyes drifted again toward the broken seal on the table. The seal bothered her more than the words themselves. It was unlike anything she had studied in medieval iconography. Most seals from that era contained identifiable elements: animals, crests, initials, symbols tied to noble houses, religious institutions, or known guilds. But this one was disturbingly simple. A circle marked with 3 faint indentations. They had no symmetry, no artistic flourish. They looked accidental, but the longer she stared, the more intentional they seemed. As though someone had pressed 3 fingertips into molten wax, not to sign the document, but to warn whoever dared to open it. She picked up the seal gently. The wax felt oddly colder than the table's surface, as though it held some echo of whatever it had once been part of. She tilted it under the light, hoping to reveal hidden markings or designs. There were none, just those silent indentations. A soft rustle echoed from the far side of the room. Eleanor stiffened but it was only the evening shift librarian walking through the stacks, preparing to close the building. She decided it was time to ask for help. Not about the manuscripts. Contessa wasn't ready to share those, but about the seal. She needed insight from someone who had spent decades handling medieval documents. She brought the broken seal and the manuscript to the front desk, where Mr. Alden, the elderly curator, was sorting catalog cards with slow, deliberate cards. His silver-rimmed glasses hung low on his nose, and his thin white hair caught the lamplight behind him. "Mr. Alden," Eleanor said softly, "can I show you something?" He looked up, smiling the way librarians often do when a young researcher finds something exciting. "Of course, Miss Finch. What have you discovered?" Eleanor laid the manuscript on the counter, but kept it partly closed so that only the seal was visible. "I found this in the uncatalogued section. The seal, do you recognize it?" Mr. Alden leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. At first, he seemed puzzled. Then his face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. His hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached out, stopping a few inches above the seal as if afraid to touch it. He withdrew his hand slowly, as though the wax might burn him. "Where did you find this?" His voice was quieter now, stripped of the warmth it normally held. "In the medieval cabinet," Eleanor replied. "It wasn't labeled. I've never seen a seal like this." "Have you?" Mr. Alden's eyes shifted around the room, checking whether anyone else was near. The library was virtually empty. "Miss Finch," he whispered, "how long has it been open?" "A few minutes," she said. "Why? Is it dangerous?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved again to the wax seal, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice Eleanor had never heard from him: fear. "This seal should not exist," he said. "It's older than any document in our collection, yet it belongs to no known institution. It was not used by the church, nor by any monarchy, nor by academic guilds." "Then who used it?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Alden pressed his lips together. He looked like a man who wanted to choose his words carefully, but no longer had the luxury. "There are stories among archivists," he sighed slowly. "Not academic stories, private ones. Stories we don't put in courses or books. There were groups in medieval Europe that didn't leave proper records. They didn't want to be found. Some used symbols not for identification, but as warnings to others who handled their work." "A warning," Eleanor repeated. The chill returned to her spine. He nodded. This was meant to discourage the curious. Eleanor hesitated, then dared to ask, "Have you seen this symbol before?" Mr. Alden swallowed. "Only twice in my life. Both times the manuscripts were removed from circulation by higher authorities, and both times, those who tried to study them stopped voluntarily or otherwise." She felt her pulse in her throat. "You mean something happened to them?" "I don't know," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "But I do know that scholars who opened these seals never worked on the material for long. They all abandoned their research abruptly. One resigned from academia entirely." Eleanor stared at him. The idea that a symbol could unnerve seasoned historians was unsettling. "But you've never told anyone? Never written about it?" Mr. Alden shook his head. "Some knowledge is set aside for a reason." Eleanor felt the push of something heavy inside her chest, equal parts fear and the powerful pull of discovery. "I can't just ignore it," she said quietly. "This manuscript contains something important. I can feel it." He sighed deeply, a sound filled with decades of lost enthusiasm and quiet resignation. "You're young, ambitious. I understand. I once was too. But Miss Finch, there are truths that do not want to be found. If a seal like this was placed on a manuscript, the writer wanted future generations to proceed with caution. I am being cautious," Eleanor said. "Not cautious enough." He closed the manuscript gently, pushing it slightly back toward her. "Take my advice, Miss Finch. Don't read too far tonight. Sleep. Let your mind rest before you dive deeper. Sometimes the past is clearer when you don't chase it in exhaustion." His words were well meant, but Eleanor could sense he was Zunti, just warning her. As a librarian, he was warning her as someone who had seen researchers broken by things they didn't understand. Still, she nodded politely. "Thank you, Mr. Alden. I'll be careful." But as she walked out of the library into the cool night air, She already knew she would not leave the manuscript untouched. Curiosity had taken hold, stronger than fear. When she reached her small apartment, she placed the manuscript on her desk. The lamplight cast a soft glow over it. The broken seal rested beside it like an artifact from another world. She sat down slowly, listening to the quiet of her room. Outside, distant city sounds murmured like a faraway river, but inside everything was still. She opened the manuscript again. The pages smelled faintly of age, smoke, and something else. Like a memory trapped in the fibers. She read the lines she had seen earlier, then turned the page. The writing shifted from warnings to personal grief. I have seen men disappear for speaking truth. I have watched scribes burned with their own parchment. I have heard the chants of those who claim they guard the world from chaos, when in truth they guard only their own power. Eleanor exhaled slowly. This wasn't religious paranoia. It wasn't political rhetoric. It was testimony. If I fail to finish this record, let it be known that I did not die from disease, nor from accident. They do not forgive those who write what was never meant to be written. The next lines were shakier, ink blotting slightly at the edges. The Brotherhood leaves no graves. They leave no names. Only silence. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. A silence heavier than the room should have held seemed to press around her, as if the manuscript absorbed the space, drawing her further into its shadow. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something she hadn't before. The edges of the page bore faint, nearly invisible impressions, not ink pressure marks, like someone had held the parchment tightly while writing. Or perhaps, while trembling. Eleanor felt a strange sympathy for the long-dead scribe. Whoever he had been, he must have written with both desperation and hope, a hope that someone in the future would read his words, understand his warnings, and perhaps finish what he could not. She leaned back in her chair, letting the soft hum of her desk lamp soothe the room. But even the warm light could not push away the feeling that she was no longer entirely alone with the manuscript. The wax seal on the table caught the corner of her eye. It seemed different now, somehow heavier with meaning. Eleanor reached for it again. The 3 indentations felt deeper than she remembered, though she knew that had to be imagination. Yet the thought would not leave her. What if the seal was less a symbol of secrecy and more a sign of danger? What if it had been placed not to hide a manuscript from the world, but to warn the world about what would happen if it ever Eleanor sat very still. Someone, somewhere in history, had wanted these pages sealed forever. And someone, somewhere in the present, might remember what that seal meant. She didn't want to believe the thought that followed, but it settled over her all the same. Whatever waited inside this manuscript had been kept silent for centuries. And silence is rarely preserved without purpose. The moon hung low over Iron, thinning into a silver sliver that trembled behind drifting clouds, as though it feared witnessing what Rohan and Marcellus were about to discover. The two moved carefully along the stone corridor beneath the archives, lanterns raised, boots muffled by the dust of centuries. The air smelled of old parchment, stale earth, and somewhere far below something metallic. Rohan paused, letting the lantern light fall across markings carved into the wall. A series of interlocking spirals, each one looping inward endlessly. The same symbol had appeared the night before in the decayed manuscript, they'd found hidden inside the false spine of an old chronicle. The spirals meant something, perhaps territory, or power, or danger. They looked almost hypnotic in the flicker of the lantern flame. Marcellus drew a slow breath. If these tunnels were simply old storehouses, they wouldn't carry symbols like these. Rohan nodded. They're markers. Someone wanted these passages found only by those who knew the signs. Marcellus allowed a faint, rueful smile. Then we had either the intended audience, or extremely unfortunate intruders. They walked farther until the tunnel widened into a circular chamber. Dusty shelves hugged the walls, each filled with scrolls wrapped in cracked red twine. A collapsed wooden table lay in the center, half buried under debris and mold. Rowan brushed aside the fragments and uncovered a slate tablet, its surface etched with meticulous symbols. A language, yes, but not one used in any court or monastery, they knew. Marcellus leaned closer. Whoever crafted this wrote with precision. This wasn't secret because it was mystical. It was secret because someone didn't want it read. The two spent a long while studying the strange patterns. until Rohan discovered a set of scrolls in the shelf's deepest corner. These were newer perhaps, only a century old, though still aged enough to crumble if held too tightly. Rohan unwrapped one and scanned the jagged lines of writing. It was a ledger, not of crops or taxes, but of people names, occupations, dates, all recorded meticulously, and next to several entries, the same looping spiral. Rohan exhaled through his nose. The shape of a realization began forming, sharp as a tooth. These people went missing. Marcellus looked over Rowan's shoulder. Vanished without official record. The king always blamed bandits or border skirmishes, except these names belonged to scholars, herbalists, builders, not soldiers or travelers. They vanished because someone took them. Marcellus folded his arms, shoulders tightening. We need to understand why. They continued searching until Rohan uncovered a larger scroll bound in thick leather. When he unrolled it, an intricate map unfurled across the dusty floor. But it wasn't a map of Iron as they knew it. This map showed the city with additional buildings, courtyards, and pathways that either never existed or belonged to some earlier era. But the most startling details were the sections beneath the city, vast networks of chambers and routes, neatly labeled with the spiral symbol. Marcellus knelt beside Rohan. Someone built an entire world beneath Iron. Not for shelter, Rohan murmured. For secrecy. A faint sound echoed behind them, water dripping somewhere in the gloom. Or perhaps a shifting stone. Rowan tightened his grip on the lantern. Every discovery added weight to a suspicion that had begun the night they found evidence of the forged plague decree in the royal archives. That document had revealed that what everyone believed to be a divine curse centuries ago had, in truth, been a manipulated engineered fear to consolidate authority. And now here, beneath the city, they had stumbled onto something older than that deception. Rowan folded the map carefully. Whoever used these tunnels had influence, enough to abduct skilled people and keep their work hidden. Marcellus sighed quietly. There is a pattern. The forged plague decree. The vanishing scholars. The spiral. Pieces of a puzzle no historian ever dared imagine. Rowan placed a hand on the stone wall for balance. If this is a conspiracy, it spans generations. The lantern light glowed warm against the stone ceiling, tracing shadows shaped like crooked fingers. Rohan felt a tremor beneath his palm, a vibration faint enough to mistake for imagination. He glanced at Marcellus, who seemed not to notice. Unsettled, Rowan listened. The sound returned. A soft, rhythmic hum. Machinery. Water. Or perhaps a draft traveling through long-forgotten shafts. Before they could investigate further, Marcellus found a locked chest tucked beneath an uneven slab of stone. Its metal bands were rusted, but its lock looked surprisingly intact. Rohan tried to pry it open, but it held firm. "We'll bring it back to the surface," Marcellus said. "Someone in the workshop will know how to open it without breaking the contents." They collected the scrolls, the ledger of names, and the map, then marked the chamber's entrance with chalk so they could return later. The echoing hum followed them all the way back through the passageways, lingering like a presence, aware of their intrusion. When they reached the surface, dawn was beginning to rise. The city looked harmless from above quiet streets, shuttered windows, smoke curling gently from the baker's chimney. Yet beneath that calm lay the truth. An underworld carved deliberately and meticulously, likely by minds unwilling to share their convictions with the public. Inside Marcellus's study, sunlight slowly brightened the wooden floor. Rohan spread out the documents again. The list of vanished artisans felt heavier now under the fresh daylight, like a catalogue of stolen futures. One name caught Rowan's attention. Alice Corvain, builder of water channels, missing for 70 years. The spiral symbol appeared beside her name, larger than the others. Marcellus noticed Rohan staring. She engineered half the aqueduct design still used today. He rubbed his chin. Her disappearance caused outrage at the time. The official story claimed illness. But illness doesn't require secrecy, Rowan said. Or a symbol. Their conversation halted when Marcellus's apprentice entered with a pale face and ink-stained fingers. "Master," the young man said softly, "I ran the symbols in the slate tablet against coded patterns you taught me. The spirals aren't marking names or places. Marcellus lifted an eyebrow. Then what do they represent? The apprentice hesitated. Meetings, times, coordinates. These aren't symbols of identity. They're instructions. Rowan felt a shiver, meaning the tunnels weren't just for storage or hiding. They were for gatherings. The apprentice nodded slowly. Organized ones. Marcellus exchanged a glance with Rowan. An underground society. Rowan stared down at the ledger, his mind assembling the fragments like constellations. A society powerful enough to remove people from public life, redirect knowledge, and shape events without leaving clear records. Marcellus spoke softly. If such a group still exists, we're no longer researchers uncovering the past. We've become witnesses. The day moved forward with a heavy quietness. Rohan spent hours comparing the names on the ledger to public records, checking the dates of their disappearance against city events. A pattern emerged. Each disappearance coincided with a political shift or a convenient royal decree. The forged plague order they had discovered earlier aligned perfectly with two vanising. A decree to reroute taxes matched another. A sudden change in military leadership aligned with yet another. These weren't random. They were strategic. Rowan leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. A story formed to a knot of supernatural curses or whispered miracles, but of people manipulating belief in history with precision. They weren't gods or mystics. They were planners who understood fear and knowledge better than most rulers. Marcellus studied Rohan's expression. The truth, once uncovered, becomes difficult to ignore. Rowan managed a faint smile. It also becomes heavier. Night returned, covering the city in soft darkness. Lanterns glowed along the streets like resting fireflies. Rowan found himself walking along the old stone bridge outside the main gate, listening to water lapping below. Every quiet detail of the city now felt layered, like an illusion cast over something deeper. The spiros didn't feel abstract anymore. They felt watchful. A figure approached slowly from the far end of the bridge-god. Perhaps, Rowan's shoulders stiffened instinctively. But as the figure drew closer, Rowan noticed the person wore a scholar's cloak, not a weapon. The stranger lifted a hand gently. "You searched the lower archives," the stranger said. The voice was calm, almost soothing. "You found what many before you sought." Rowan's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" The stranger stepped into the lantern light. Their face was lined with age, yet their eyes held an alertness that suggested many sleepless years. "Someone who tried to stop what you are now unraveling." Rowan's voice lowered. "The tunnels. The vanished scholars. The symbols." The stranger nodded. "What you found is only the first layer." Rowan's breath felt thin. "How many layers exist?" The stranger looked toward the city lights, enough that you should proceed carefully. Truth is a powerful thing, but those who fear it are often more powerful. Before Rohan could ask anything more, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog that had begun to drift across the bridge. Rohan stood still, aware that the path ahead was becoming darker, more complex, more dangerous. Yet he also felt something steady building inside him, a quiet resolve. Knowledge had always been his compass, and now it was guiding him towards something larger than a lost ledger or a hidden chamber. The past wasn't dead. It was breathing beneath the city, waiting for someone to hear it, and Rohan intended to listen. The story now stretches toward deeper corridors where the spiral symbols grow sharper, and the truth begins to shift from quiet speculation into vivid revelation. Eleanor barely slept that night. She turned the lamp off, but the darkness made the manuscript feel more alive than before. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the faceless men described by the scribe watching, waiting, standing in the corners of dimly lit monasteries or slipping silently through stone corridors. She knew it was only her mind trying to fill the silence with shapes, but the unease refused to leave her. Around 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and sat by the window of her apartment. The quiet streets below were washed in the pale glow of the street lamps. A soft mist curled around the sidewalks, blurring the shapes of distant buildings. She sipped a glass of water, trying to steady her thoughts, but her gaze kept drifting to the darker corners of the street. Nothing moved there, yet she felt watched, not by a person she could see, but by an expectation, as if the manuscript had awakened something that now followed her beyond the walls of the library. She returned to her desk. The manuscript lay where she had left it, untouched, closed so gently that it barely seemed disturbed. The broken seal still rested beside it. Eleanor picked up the manuscript again and opened it to a page she hadn't read yet. The handwriting appeared more hurried here, the strokes uneven. "My name must not be written. If they find these words, they will know I defied them." Eleanor exhaled slowly. The writer had erased his identity intentionally, but further down the page, she saw something that caught her attention. A line half crossed out, as though the scribe had changed his mind at the last moment. "I was once a keeper at St. Remilus Abbey, in the mountains north of the place." Name was smeared out, but not entirely. She could still make out the faint beginnings of two letters, C and A. It wasn't much, but it was something. A location. A real place. She turned the manuscript toward the light, trying to read the faded part, but the ink had been deliberately smudged while still wet. Whoever wrote this didn't he want his location to be Nonor. Perhaps he feared that revealing it would endanger others. Eleanor Reed. And the Brotherhood came not as warriors, but as shadows draped in silence. They spoke to no one. They demanded nothing. Yet their presence bent the will of the abbot himself. They claimed they carried truth for the future. Truth that must be protected. But what they protected was a lie woven carefully into the world's memory. Her skin prickled. These weren't the rantings of a frightened monk. These were observations from someone directly involved. Someone who had witnessed events firsthand. She could feel his fear embedded in every stroke of ink. A distant sound made her look up. A soft crack from outside, like a footstep on wet pavement. She pushed aside the curtain and stared down again at the street. Still, nothing. Still, only fog and light. Her breath left a faint mark on the window pane. When she leaned back, something inside her whispered that her life had shifted course. Once she started reading this manuscript, curiosity had become responsibility. Now it was becoming danger. By morning, she made herself a cup of coffee strong enough to fight exhaustion and carried the manuscript in a padded folder. She couldn't study it entirely alone, not without some broader academic grounding. She needed someone knowledgeable in medieval monastic history. Someone who might help her understand who the anonymous scribe could have been and what abbey he was referring to. So she arranged to meet Professor David Harlan, a historian who had a reputation for knowing obscure monastic orders better than anyone at the university. He greeted her warmly in his office, a small room filled with books stacked in orderly towers, maps of medieval Europe pinned to the walls, and a single window that let in the late morning sun. "You look tired, Eleanor," he said kindly. "Overworked?" "Something like that," she replied with a strained smile. "I found a manuscript last night. I think it might be important." Professor Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Important manuscripts don't usually appear in the middle of the night." "Let me see." Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't planned to show him the whole thing, only a few lines. She slid the folder open just enough for him to see the wax seal. The moment his eyes landed on it, his posture changed. The smile faded. He leaned forward, taking a closer look. "Where did this come from?" he asked quietly. His tone reminded her of Mr. Alden's reaction, a tone that carried concerned curiosity. "The Eastbourne Library," she replied. "It wasn't catalogued." He didn't reach out to touch the seal. His hand stayed on the desk, tightening slightly. "Eleanor," he said, his voice lower now. "I'm going to ask you something unusual. Has anyone else seen this?" "Mr. Alden," she said. "But no one else." Professor Harlan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the 3 indentations. "There are very few symbols from that era that generate concern among scholars. Most are harmless, decorative, representational. This isn't one of them." "You know it then?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "Did the manuscript mention anything about a brotherhood?" Eleanor felt a chill at the back of her neck. "Yes." Professor Harlan closed his eyes briefly, as though confirming a suspicion he had hoped to be wrong about. When he opened them again, his expression had changed. He was no longer simply a professor. He was someone who understood something deeper. "Eleanor," he said softly, Some historical groups operated in secrecy so deep that they became invisible over time. If this manuscript is what I think it is, it references a group that historians whisper about but never investigate publicly. The Brotherhood of the Veil, she said, his breath caught. For a moment, he said nothing. Then very softly he whispered, "You should stop reading it." The words were too familiar. She had heard them from Mr. Olden, too. "Why is everyone saying that?" she demanded. "It's just history." Eleanor forced herself to stand and headed toward the security room. She rarely entered it, but today she needed answers. The night guard had already left, but the security system saved at least 24 hours of footage. She rewound the recording to the hour after she had left. The camera that faced the reading room showed the empty space, shelves standing still in the dim, bluish nightlight. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then Eleanor froze. A shadow moved across the frame. Not a person. Not exactly. There was no clear outline of a body or clothing. It looked like a distortion in the darkness, a shape that absorbed the light around it, bending it subtly as it passed between the shelves. It lingered near her table, the camera flickering faintly as though struggling to capture it clearly. The shape leaned over the manuscript. Eleanor's throat tightened painfully. Then the shadow shifted, turning though there was no face, no head, nothing to identify, and moved out of frame with a slow, drifting motion that looked less like walking and more like gliding. The camera flickered again. For a moment, the screen went black. When the image returned, the room was still. Eleanor backed away from the monitor. Her hands felt cold. Whatever she had seen wasn't something she could rationalize with tiredness or misinterpretation. Something had been in the library after she left. Something that had no business being there. Something that didn't walk like a human. Yet, impossibly, it had touched her manuscript. She rushed back to the table, feeling a strange urgency, as though time had started moving faster without warning. She opened the manuscript to page 8. Her fingers hovered over the parchment before she began reading again. "The Brotherhood found us at last. They came at dusk, moving with no sound. Faces wrapped in cloth, as though hiding deformities or perhaps hiding the absence of faces at all. We had heard stories, but nothing prepared us for the truth. They carried no torches, yet the shadows bent toward them, as if welcoming an old friend." Eleanor felt a cold prickle crawl up her spine. My fellow scribes tried to flee, but the watchers moved too swiftly. They passed through doorways without opening them, appeared behind us without footsteps. Their cloth coverings did not shift, did not show the shape of mouths or eyes. Some believed there was nothing beneath the veil at all. She read the words twice, each time feeling an increasing pressure at the base of her skull. "They took our writings first. Always the writings. They burned what they found, but not with fire from wood or oil." The parchment curled on its own, blackening as if touched by darkness itself. The manuscript felt hotter now, the parchment warming under her fingers. They whispered without voices. Their warnings echoed inside our minds. Those who tried to resist lost themselves. I saw one scribe fall to his knees, clutching his head, screaming that he heard them inside his thoughts. Eleanor pressed her lips together. "I write now in secret. If they find this, if they discover these pages, they will erase even the memory of what we tried to preserve." The ink here was darker, heavier, as though the writer pressed the quill with trembling force. "If anyone finds this in the future, know this. They do not age. They do not die. They are not bound by time. They protected their truth in my age, and they will protect it in yours." Eleanor's heart stopped for half a beat. The hairs on her arms rose. What she had seen in the security footage wasn't a thief or a researcher or even a person. It was something older, something that moved as though the world itself shifted to make room for it. She closed the manuscript slowly. The warning note lay beside it, small and silent. "Do not read past the 10th page." Not a threat, a plea. Eleanor stood very still. History wasn't done with her. T basta then T finished speaking, and whatever walked in the library last night, it was still out there, waiting. Eleanor did not sleep that night. Even after she closed the manuscript and turned off the lamp, her apartment felt strangely alive, as though the air carried a pulse she could not hear, but could somehow sense. The walls seemed thinner, the shadows deeper. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the faint city lights drifting across it like ghosts, searching for a place to rest. Around 2 in the morning, she heard it. A soft sound in the hallway outside her door. Not footsteps, exactly more like weight shifting, a presence adjusting itself. As if someone were standing still, and yet not entirely still. Eleanor held her breath, listening. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs. The noise stopped. She waited several minutes before climbing out of bed. The air felt colder near the door, though the heater was working fine. She looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But she knew the sound had been real. The manuscript lay on her desk, closed but humming with the memory of what she had read. She felt drawn to it, like a tide pulling her back toward the shore. Against her better judgment, she opened it again, letting the pages fall naturally to where she had left off. The next section of writing had changed tone. It no longer warned, it confessed. They came to the scriptorium at dusk. They moved without sound, cloaked not in fabric but in shadow. Their eyes were covered, yet they walked as if guided by something older than sight. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. 3 scribes were taken that night. They left no marks on the floor, no footprints, no blood, only silence. Always silence. A chill prickled her arms. The writer continued. One of the brothers told me that they serve a purpose higher than kings. They preserve order by correcting the record. History is fragile, he said. Truth must be shaped, not left wild, for a wild truth can burn nations. Eleanor whispered the words aloud. Wild truth. It struck her as both beautiful and terrifying. She read on. They warned me not to write further. They said they would return for me if I did. There's still the one you have broken is placed only on writings meant never to be read. If you have opened it, you are now a part of what they watch. Eleanor froze. They watched through time. At that moment, a soft creak came from her living room. She jerked her head up. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, as though moving in the faint glow of the streetlight. She sat very still, unsure whether fear was making her hallucinate. But she remembered the noise outside her door. She remembered Mr. Alden's pale face. And she felt, with chilling certainty, that she was no longer just reading history. She was stepping into it. The morning sun offered little comfort. Eleanor barely tasted the coffee she forced down before heading to the library. She needed Mr. Alden. She needed answers. Inside the Eastbourne Library, everything felt normal to normal. Students whispered over laptops. Researchers shuffled through papers, and the sound of quiet typing echoed faintly. It was hard to believe that somewhere in this calm, a shadow had stretched itself across centuries. She found Mr. Alden shelving books in the medieval section. Mr. Alden, Eleanor said, relieved to see him. I need to talk to you about the manuscript. He looked up slowly. The usual warmth in his eyes seemed dimmer. Manuscript, he repeated, as though the word meant nothing. The one from last night, she said cautiously. The one with the strange seal. You warned me. He held up a hand gently. Miss Finch, I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Eleanor blinked. You were afraid of the seal. You told me not to read it. Mr. Alden's smile was soft, almost grandfatherly. You've been working very hard. Perhaps you misremember. Her stomach dropped. I didn't misremember. He touched her shoulder lightly. Why don't you check the manuscript back in? Sometimes artifacts with unsettling qualities can disturb the mind. You want me to return it? She asked. His eyes flickered just for a second with something like sorrow. I think it's best. Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. Mr. Alden, are you all right? He hesitated. His throat bubbed. Of course. But she could tell he was lying. When she stepped away, she noticed a man sitting far across the reading room. Tall, stiff posture. Dark coat, despite the warm building. He wasn't reading. He wasn't writing. He was watching her. Eleanor pretended not to notice and moved to another aisle. Her heart hammered. She waited 10 seconds, then glanced again. The man had vanished. Her mind raced. Had someone spoken to Mr. Alden after she left last night? Had he been threatened? Why was someone watching her? Before leaving, she approached Mr. Alden again. "Are you sure you're all right?" she whispered. His eyes glistened not with fear, but with something heavier. Resignation. He leaned in very slowly, and in a cracked voice, he whispered, "They don't erase memories, Miss Finch. They replace them." Eleanor's breath stopped. Before she could speak, Mr. Alden straightened and said loudly, cheerfully, "Have a wonderful day." She stood frozen as he walked away. Something was very, very wrong. When Eleanor returned home, the first thing she did was pull the manuscript from her bag. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from that creeping sense of being hunted by something ancient and unseen. She opened to the page she had last read. Her breath caught. There was more writing, a full paragraph she was certain had not existed the night before. The ink was the same age. The handwriting, identical. The tone seamless, but it hadn't been there. They used a seal to silence, not the mouth, but the mind. A man who remembers too much becomes dangerous, they say. So they take not his tongue, but the pathway between truth and memory. He wakes the next morning, believing a different history. Eleanor's hands grew cold. The next lines were even worse. "I saw it happen to Brother Matthias. He spoke of what he witnessed their ritual under the moon. The next day he remembered nothing. He smiled as if nothing had happened. He said he had only dreamed." Eleanor closed her eyes, flashes of Mr. Alden's confused, distant smile haunting her. The writer continued, "Those who resist forgetting do not survive forgetting." A soft click sounded in her apartment. Eleanor's eyes shot open. It had come from the hallway near her door, the same place as last night. She moved slowly, quietly, listening. Her apartment felt like it was holding its breath. Then another sound. A faint scraping, metal brushing against metal. Someone was sliding something under her door. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously, hot hammering. On the floor, just inside the door, lay a small object, a piece of wax. Black, with 3 fingertip marks. Just like the seal, but fresh. Still warm. Eleanor stared at the warm piece of wax as though it were a living thing. Her fingers tingled as she picked it up slowly, carefully. It bore the 3 unmistakable indentations, the same silent warning that had sealed the manuscript centuries ago, but this one was modern, recent. Someone had pressed this with their fingers just minutes ago. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to the window and looked down at the street. Nothing, only the usual cars. A stray pedestrian, a cyclist passing by. No one suspicious. No one watching. But someone had been here. Inside her apartment, the manuscript lay open again as if waiting. She sat down, shook off the trembling in her hands, and forced herself to read. They do not kill out of cruelty, but out of correction. Those who chase forbidden truth chase their own erasure. They do not hide in shadows. They are the shadows. Her pulse quickened. I write this with the hope that someone in the far future, someone braver than I, will continue my story. If you are reading this, they have already noticed you. Eleanor exhaled, shakily. A final line burned into her mind. Run, if you must, but know that truth is the one thing they cannot kill. And those who chase it become part of its memory. Eleanor closed the manuscript slowly. She looked at the fresh seal fragment in her hand. They knew she had opened the manuscript. They knew she had read too far. They were watching. A lesser researcher might have fled, might have returned the manuscript, deleted the notes, and pretended none of this ever happened. But Eleanor was not like them. She had spent her whole life searching for forgotten truths, and now one had found her. She whispered into the quiet room, "I'm not running." Outside, a cold wind rattled the window gently as though acknowledging her choice. And somewhere in the hallway, something shifted softly. The watchers were awake, and so was she. Eleanor arrived at the library earlier than usual the next evening. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a pale, fading blue. She had barely slept the night before every time she closed her eyes. She kept seeing the broken wax seal, and the way the manuscript almost seemed to breathe beneath her fingertips. She wasn't ready to admit she was afraid, but something in her chest fluttered uncomfortably as she pushed open the heavy library door. The inside was unusually quiet. Not the usual warm stillness of a building full of books, but something cooler, sharper. Even the lights felt dimmer, as though a thin veil covered them. The manuscript was in her bag, wrapped carefully between folders. She told herself she had brought it back for safety reasons her apartment felt too exposed, but part of her knew she simply couldn't bear to leave it alone. As she crossed the main hall, her footsteps echoed slightly. Too much. The space didn't normally carry sound so dramatically. She walked toward her usual reading desk in the back corner, but before she reached it, she felt a shift in the air, a pressure, like someone had stepped into the room behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing. Just shelves rising like dark cliffs, rows of silent books, and the long, carpeted aisle stretching empty in both directions. Eleanor exhaled slowly and continued toward her table. Halfway there, she stopped. There it was again, a faint sound, not loud enough to be footsteps, but more than settling wood. It was soft, deliberate, as if someone was pacing a few rows away. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. She thought of Mr. Olden, telling her the seal was a warning. She thought of the scribe's trembling words about men with no faces, watchers who erase truths. She thought of the whisper she had heard 2 nights ago, one that brushed her ear like breath. She swallowed and stepped forward, guiding her feet silently on the carpet. She didn't call out. Something inside her insisted she remain quiet. She reached her table and set down her bag. The manuscript seemed to shift slightly inside, though she knew it hadn't. She unzipped the bag just enough to check it, and the leather cover peeked through, unmoved. Still. Another soft sound drifted from behind her. Eleanor turned sharply. It came from row 12, one of the older medieval stacks, where few people ever went. She listened carefully, holding her breath. At first, the silence was absolute. Then something faint moved, a single, subtle scrape, like the edge of a shoe brushing against stone. Eleanor stepped forward, feeling cold set around her ribs. She moved slowly down the aisle, each step measured. Her eyes narrowed. The overhead lights flickered once, dimming just slightly before returning to normal. When she reached the entrance to row 12, she stopped. The row was long, shadowed, lined with tall shelves that made it feel like a narrow canyon. The lights above it buzzed faintly, as though struggling to wake. There was no one inside, but something felt wrong. The air was colder here. Not winter cold, but the kind of deep cold that settled into old places. Cold that didn't come from temperature, bad from time. Eleanor stepped in. The smell of parchment and dust wrapped around her, familiar yet strangely oppressive tonight. Halfway down the row, she stopped again. There on the floor. A faint mark, not a footprint, exactly. More like an incomplete impression, a smudge of pressure in the thin layer of dust that had settled on the stone tiles. It was shaped oddly, neither fully human nor fully anything identifiable. Eleanor kneeled down, heart thudding. The dust had been disturbed very recently. Within minutes, her breath caught. Someone had been here. The whisper of air behind her made her stand upright so fast she nearly lost balance. She turned sharply. Nothing stood at the end of the row, but the temperature dropped another degree. She could feel it on her skin, prickling along her spine. Slowly, she backed out of the row, trying not to make noise. Her instincts were screaming at her now not to run, not to turn her back completely, not to draw attention. She reached the main aisle again and exhaled shakily. This was no longer paranoia. Something was here, and whatever it was, did not want to be seen. Eleanor returned to her table quickly and pulled the manuscript from her bag. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced her breathing to steady as she ran her fingers over the leather cover. The manuscript felt warm this time, like it had absorbed her anxiety, or like something inside it was awake. She opened the first few pages again, scanning the familiar lines, but as she reached the section describing the Brotherhood's watchers, she froze. A sentence she hadn't noticed before seemed to stand out with terrible clarity. They walk unseen among shelves and shadows, leaving no trace but the cold that follows them. Eleanor's grip tightened on the edge of the page. Shelves. Shadows. Cold. Exactly what she had just felt. She read further. They observe those who read what should remain closed. And once a name is known to them, it is never forgotten. Her throat went dry. Behind her, somewhere deep in the rows, something creaked. A slow, careful sound. Not random, not accidental. Eleanor stared at the manuscript, the words burning into her mind. She felt the air shift again, like the quiet inhale of someone standing just out of sight. The thought formed slowly, chilling her from the inside out. It wasn't just that she had opened the manuscript. It was that opening, it had drawn attention, and something might already know her name. Eleanor felt the weight of every hour she had spent reading, yet she couldn't pull herself away from the manuscript. Alex sat beside her, calm but visibly shaken. The two of them had worked silently for nearly an hour, each noting details, each absorbing lines that felt more like confessions whispered across centuries than historical text. The lamp cast a warm circle around them, leaving the edges of the room in soft shadow. It made Eleanor feel as though they were sitting inside a bubble of time, and the rest of the world had fallen still. Alex leaned closer to the manuscript. "Look at this part," he said quietly, pointing to a section written in darker ink. "The handwriting looks rushed." Eleanor brought her face nearer. The words trembled with urgency, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. "I was taken to the chamber where voices are forbidden. They call it the silent room. No one speaks within its walls, for the walls themselves. Listen, what is sealed there is not knowledge for the world. It is knowledge meant never to breathe air again." Eleanor's skin prickled. The silent room. It sounded like something from a legend, yet the scribe had written it without flourish or exaggeration. It felt real, because he had not tried to make it dramatic. He had simply stated it as fact. Alex exhaled slowly. "Do you think it was a place for torture? Or interrogation?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. It sounds like a vault, a place where truths were buried." She flipped to the next page. More text, weighted ink slightly faded, but legible enough. They took the records of kings. They took the words of priests. They took the testimonies of those who saw things that contradicted their design. They claim the world must be shaped, corrected. They say chaos begins with memory. And so they erase whatever they choose. Alex leaned back, absorbing each word with visible discomfort. "This wasn't just censorship," he murmured. "This was something far bigger. Systemic. Organized." Eleanor nodded. "And effective. If they erased enough, we would never know." She turned the page slowly, careful not to damage the delicate parchment. The next section described a place that made her chest tighten. There was a chamber beneath the monastery. "It is kept in darkness. They call it the chamber without echo. And in it, they hide the things they fear, most the truths they cannot destroy, the names they cannot allow to survive." The scribe continued. "It is said that the chamber has no sound, not because it is empty, but because those who enter never return." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, letting the words settle in her thoughts. "He wasn't writing folklore," she whispered. "He was documenting something he saw firsthand." Alex nodded, and he knew he wasn't supposed to survive it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt denser, as if the manuscript itself exhaled the memories it carried. Eleanor sat up straighter. "There's something else here," she said, pointing to a faint note in the margin. The letters were tiny, squeezed between two lines, almost as if the writer had added them after reconsideration. "They watch through those who do not blink." Eleanor frowned. "He mentioned them before." "What do you think he meant?" Alex hesitated. "Not blinking could just be symbolic. Maybe he meant people who follow orders blindly, or people who never look away from their mission." "Maybe," Eleanor said, though the explanation did little to ease the unease curling in her stomach. The room felt colder now. She turned another page. The final lines on the leaf were short, as though written in a hurry. "If this reaches a future hand, flee from the chamber. Seek no door that has no echo." And if they find you, the sentence ended there. The ink trailed off the page slightly, as if the pen had been pulled away mid-stroke. Alex stared at the unfinished line, his face tense. He didn't get to finish. Eleanor touched the edge of the parchment softly. Something interrupted him. She didn't say it aloud, but she felt certain now. The scribe had not died peacefully, and whatever had silenced him had wanted silence to be the only record. She closed the manuscript gently and leaned back, releasing a slow breath. Hours had passed without her noticing. Her body was tired, her eyes heavy, but her mind was wide awake, too awake. Alex finally stood, stretching his arms. "You should rest," he sighed softly. "You've been reading non-stop." "I know," Eleanor replied, though rest felt impossible. Alex hesitated by the door. "Are you going to be okay alone tonight?" Eleanor forced a smile. "I'll be fine." "I'll be fine." He gave a weak laugh, nodded, and left. When the door clicked shut, silence filled the apartment again. Eleanor sat for a long moment, listening to her own breathing, trying to shake the weight of the manuscript's words. Eventually, she stood and placed the manuscript on her desk. The wax seal lay beside it, harmless in appearance, yet carrying a long shadow. She turned off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway drifting into the room. Her bed felt warm and familiar, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silent chamber, the 3 strange indentations in the seal, the unfinished sentence. She lay still, listening. At first, it was nothing, just the hum of the city outside. Then, very faintly, she heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment door. Her eyes opened. The footfalls did not come closer, nor did they fade. They simply stopped right outside her door, as though someone had paused, listening. Eleanor held her breath. Seconds passed, then more seconds. Finally, silence returned. She sat up slowly, heart pounding. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, still, innocent looking, but she knew someone had been standing there, watching, listening. And they did not knock. She stepped back from the door, cold settling in her chest. For the first time since the manuscript had entered her hands, Eleanor realized something chilling. She was no longer the only one reading its secrets. The past was watching her. And now, the present was too. Eleanor barely slept the night after her meeting with Professor Harrington. She had gone to bed late, exhausted from the weight of the unfolding mystery. Yet her mind refused to quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scribe's trembling handwriting, the faceless figures described in the margins, the wax seal with its strange indentations, and the professor's shifting expression when he realized what she had discovered. Morning arrived in a pale gray wash of light leaking through her curtains. She sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and felt a sharp tug of unease in her chest. Something was different. She couldn't explain it at first, so she scanned the room carefully. The bookshelf looked the same. The scattered papers on her desk were exactly as she had left them. The manuscript remained inside the protective folder she had placed it in. But when her eyes reached the chair by the window, she stopped. It wasn't where she remembered leaving it. She always kept that chair pushed in under the table, angled slightly. Now it sat a foot away, turned toward the window as if someone had been sitting there, watching the street below. She frowned. Maybe she had moved it last night and forgotten. Maybe she had been pacing while thinking. Maybe. But the explanation didn't feel right. Something inside her rejected it instantly. She got out of bed and examined the window. The latch was closed, but there were faint scratches on the metal thing. Fresh ones. The kind left by someone unfamiliar with the mechanism. Her breath tightened. She told herself it could have been caused by the wind rattling the frame. Or maybe she had closed it too fast last night. But deep down, she knew she didn't make those marks. They were too deliberate, too clean. She whispered into the emptiness of her apartment. "You're imagining things." But the words sounded weak, like even she wasn't convinced. After a long shower and a cup of coffee that did little to ease her nerves, she sat down at her desk, opened the manuscript, and continued reading. If anything could steady her mind, it would be grounding herself in research, even if the research itself was unsettling. The next section of the manuscript was written in a darker ink, as though the scribe had dipped the pen more frequently, trying to write quickly before the opportunity slipped away. They do not knock. They do not speak. They arrive in silence and leave in silence, and often the only sign that they have visited is something small moved out of place. A chair turned, a window left unlatched, a candle extinguished, though no breeze is present. Eleanor felt her fingers go still on the page. She read the lines again. They let you know they have been there not to harm you. Not yet, but to remind you that your life is not on. A slow chill crept up her spine. Her eyes drifted toward the window again. The chair, the scratches, the faint, cold prickle she had felt the evening before. It was too similar. She forced herself to continue reading. The Brotherhood of the Veil is patient. They believe that fear itself is a tool. True threats are reserved only for those who persist after the warnings. Most stop, a few vanish. The room felt smaller as she absorbed the words. The warning didn't feel medieval anymore. It felt immediate. Coincidence, she whispered, though her voice cracked. Just coincidence. She tried to focus on translating the next lines. The scribe spoke of records erased, letters disappearing before they reached their recipients, historians frightened into silence. The Brotherhood did not always use violence. They preferred doubt. Doubt was cleaner. Doubt left no trail. Eleanor glanced again at the chair by the window. It stood there motionless, harmless, but she could not shake the feeling that someone had been in her apartment, someone who had known exactly what they were doing. The rest of the morning drifted by slowly. She tried to make breakfast, but found herself checking the door twice, then 3 times. She checked the hallway through the peephole, seeing nothing but empty carpet and muted light. She checked her phone for messages she thought might never arrive. Her thoughts felt like they were moving in circles, yet to vent through the fear her. Determination only grew stronger. If someone truly didn't want this manuscript read, then its contents must be more significant than she ever imagined. Fear wasn't going to stop her. Not now. The afternoon, she regained enough focus to return to the manuscript. The scribe described the Brotherhood's methods of surveillance, never written explicitly, always hinted at, described in metaphors that felt strangely modern. Their eyes are everywhere but see nowhere. Their presence is not in the body, but in the unsettled air one senses when one is watched. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest that she tried to breathe through. She turned the page, and the ink changed once more lighter now, as though the scribe had been losing time or resources. I write quickly. They came last night. They touched nothing but left. Everything changed. Enog to kuno, enog to fear. Enough to ove. I have days, perhaps hours. Eleanor sat back, letting the weight of the words settle around her. The scribe had lived this centuries ago, yet she felt as if he were describing her apartment, her night, her morning. It made no rational sense for someone to break into her home, just to move a chair or touch a window latch. But whoever sealed this manuscript hadn't been rational either. Their power lay in control, in psychological pressure, in making the researcher doubt their own senses. She closed the manuscript gently, as though it were a living thing that needed rest. Evening approached slowly, the sky turning the color of dull silver. Eleanor left a single lamp on, its soft glow stretching across her living room. She tried reading another book, something unrelated, something comforting, but she found herself glancing at the door too often. By the time she prepared for bed, her nerves felt raw again. She brushed her teeth, turned off the lights, and lingered by the front door, checking the lock once more. Then she went to her bedroom, turned off the lamp, and lay down. It took a long time for exhaustion to quiet her thoughts. Just as she felt herself slipping toward sleep, she heard it. A faint sound. Soft. Close. Right outside her door. Almost like the creak of a floorboard, followed by the unmistakable sensation, not quite a sound, more a feeling that someone had stepped back. Her eyes shot open. Her breathing stopped. Silence followed. Heavy, deliberate silence. She waited. Every muscle in her body tensed. She strained her ears until they ached. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the silence itself felt meaningful, like the scribe's words made real. After a long, trembling moment, she whispered into the darkness, "Who's there?" No answer came. Yet she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whether it was imagination or something far more real, she was no longer a researcher. Studying a manuscript, she was part of the story now, and something was watching to see what she would do next. Eleanor did not realize how tired she was until she reached her hotel room. The hallway was long and dim, lit by a series of oil lamps that cast soft golden circles along the carpet. Every circle of light felt like an island floating in a sea of shadows. Her footsteps echoed quietly, and the sound made her acutely aware that she was alone on the 7th floor. When she reached her room, she paused before entering. Something felt unfamiliar in the air, not threatening, but strangely expectant, as though the silence itself waited for her to make a move. She shook the thought away, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Her room looked exactly as she had left it. Neatly made bed, small desk by the window, the lamp she always kept on low at night. But tonight, the air felt different, cooler, almost touched by the same chill she had felt in the library. She placed the manuscript gently on the desk and sat down. For a moment, she simply looked at it, letting her breath settle. The events of the past 24 hours pressed on her shoulders like a weight. The library whispers, the strange sensation at the museum, the translucent figure captured in the footage, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle, assembling themselves faster than she could process. She opened the manuscript again. The next page contained a long stretch of writing, the ink lighter than before, as though the scribe had been running out of materials or time. Her eyes followed the words slowly. They watch from places where light does not reach. They move in silence, for they have learned to carry the quiet with them. The Order calls them the Watchers, though they are no order at lonely shadows kept alive by purpose. I have seen them slip between crowds, walk behind torches without casting flame, stand at the edge of a hall where no footsteps should echo. Eleanor blinked, breathing more carefully now. The description felt eerily similar to the figure she had seen on the museum. As footage, a person-shaped outline moving as though it belonged to surroundings that did not respond to it. I once glimpsed a watcher behind me at dusk, the writing continued. He stood at a distance, where the light of the monastery lanterns ended. Had he wished to kill me, a cool abbé? But they do not kill without purpose. Their task is to observe, to ensure obedience, to silence those who break the page of history they have read. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the manuscript. Another line read, "If any voice rises to contradict their version of truth, they appear not as men, but as reminders. No words, no threats, only presence, enough to bend the strongest resolve." Eleanor sat back slowly, goosebumps prickling across her arms. The words couldn't possibly be connected to her experience. They were centuries apart, separated by worlds of time and culture. Yet the descriptions felt close. A faint sound broke the stillness. It came from the hallway, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, like the sound of fabric brushing lightly against a wall. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. She stayed absolutely still, her eyes fixed on the door. The sound came again, this time closer. Not loud, not urgent, just a presence, moving with the deliberate softness of someone who didn't want to be noticed. She leaned forward slightly. A shadow passed across the thin line of light under the door. Just a second, no more. But it moved not like a trick of the lamps outside, but with purpose. The shadow of someone standing just beyond the door. Her breath stopped. She waited. The hallway fell silent again, as though whoever or whatever had paused after realizing she was aware. She told herself to stand, to look through the peephole, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The sound of her heartbeat seemed too loud, and she worried it might be heard through the door. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Finally, she forced herself to rise. Step by cautious step, When she reached the door, she hesitated before looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. At least, it appeared empty. But the air outside seemed to tremble faintly, as if someone had only just stepped out of sight. Eleanor locked the door again, turning the deadbolt twice. She stepped back and exhaled slowly, trying to push away the rising tension inside her chest. It could have been a guest from another room, or a cleaner working late, or her imagination, heightened by hours of reading unsettling texts. But deep down, she knew the difference between imagination and instinct. An instinct told her that someone had been there standing still, listening, perhaps waiting. She returned to the manuscript. It lay open as though encouraging her to continue. "The Watchers do not speak," the scribe wrote. "Their presence is their message. Once they notice you, it means they have begun to weigh your value to the silence they keep. And when they weigh you, they follow." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly. She read the next lines twice to make sure she understood them. "Some say they can move through walls of stone, not as ghosts, but because they walk in the spaces between light and matter. I cannot say if this is true. I only know that when I fled the monastery, I saw one of them standing inside the cloister before I could open the door." A chill ran down her spine. "You cannot run from something that does not journey as you do." She closed the manuscript carefully, not out of fear, but to stop the tremor in her hands. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. On the inside edge of the leather cover, nearly invisible, was a faint smudge of ash. It was tiny, barely noticeable unless the light struck it at the right angle. But it was real, and it was fresh enough not to have been from medieval times. Someone had touched this manuscript recently. Someone other than her. The realization settled into her chest like a slow-moving stone. The seal, the silent watcher in the footage, the shadow tonight, the smudge of ash. These were not coincidences. History was not only whispering to her. Something from history was paying attention. Eleanor looked toward the locked door again, then toward the manuscript resting in the warm lamplight. The scribe's voice had traveled across centuries to warn her, and now she finally understood the warning. If the Watchers had appeared to the scribe when he began uncovering the truth, then their reappearance now meant only one thing. The Brotherhood never died. It had simply waited. Eleanor had never been the kind of person who jumped at shadows. But ever since she and Jonah started reading the translated fragments together, the shadows were no longer silent. They felt awake, aware, almost attentive. That night, while Jonah prepared tea in her small kitchen, she stood near the window and stared down at the street below. A dark sedan sat parked across from her building. Nothing unusual. City streets always had cars. But this one was different. The windows were tinted darker than legal limits. It hadn't been there earlier, and its engine wasn't off. She could see faint exhaust drifting upward like smoke from a quiet fire. She pulled the curtain back just slightly. Jonah walked up behind her. "You keep glancing out there? Something wrong?" "There's a car that's been sitting there for over an hour," she said quietly. "Engine still running. Could be anyone," Jonah offered, though his tone lacked conviction. "People don't usually sit in parked cars alone in a quiet neighborhood at midnight," she replied. He didn't disagree. Instead, he walked closer to the window but stayed far enough back that he wouldn't be visible. He watched the dark shape of the sedan for a few long seconds. Then he exhaled, slowly. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something before this gets worse." "Worse?" she whispered. "What's already happening?" Jonah motioned for her to step away from the window. When they moved back to the table, he lowered his voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "You know how the manuscript describes how the Brotherhood operated? How they preserved their secrecy?" Eleanor nodded. "They didn't rely only on fear or power. They relied on listening, on watching. Their greatest strength wasn't violence, it was surveillance. Medieval surveillance." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How?" Jonah's expression tightened. "In the Middle Ages, information traveled through scribes, messengers, merchants, church officials. The Brotherhood had members in all of those places. They knew things before kings did. They heard whispers before priests confessed them. They controlled what people could say and what they could write. Eleanor felt a coldness wrap around her spine. And now, Jonah didn't answer at first. He picked up her phone from the table, turned it around slowly in his hand, then placed it face down again. We assume they vanished centuries ago, but secret groups don't die, they adapt. They change their tools. They change the world by changing how information moves. He paused. If the Brotherhood survived into the modern era, they wouldn't be reading parchment. They would be reading data. They did, Luke replied. But they found nothing. Only his notes, pages of Tem torn apart, scribbled over, many of them unreadable. The only phrase that appeared more than once was, "The seal is wrong." Eleanor tightened her grip on the manuscript. The basement suddenly felt colder. "And you think he, Sevegan?" "I think he was looking at something the library never meant to keep open." Luke motioned toward the end of the corridor. "And that room, he spent a lot of time in it." They walked slowly until they reached a door unlike any other. It was small, barely wide enough for one person, and reinforced with iron bands that looked painfully out of place in a modern building. Dust covered most of the wood, but someone long ago had carved a symbol above the center. A circle. 3 small indentations, the same as the seal. Eleanor stared at it, unable to move for a moment. The symbol looked older here, not pressed into wax, but gouged directly into the wood, as though carved with something sharp and deliberate. She raised her fingers and traced the outline lightly. The wood felt colder than the air around it. "This room has been locked for as long as I've worked here," Luke said quietly. "Before that, it was sealed off because of some incident involving damaged manuscripts. Officially, it's unsafe for use. Unofficially." He paused. "No one wants to step inside." Eleanor felt a tremor run down her spine. "But we need to." Luke nodded, though his eyes betrayed hesitation. "Yes, but we do it carefully. No rushing." She glanced at the old rusted lock. It wasn't modern jest. A simple turnkey, the kind used before digital systems replaced physical locks. Luke slid out a ring of keys he had taken from the office, flipping through them until he found one equally old and tarnished. When he inserted it into the lock, a sharp metallic click echoed through the basement. It sounded too loud, too alive, like something had stirred on the other side of the door. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. "Did you hear that?" Luke swallowed, probably just the hinges. But she could tell he didn't believe it. She didn't either. He turned the key gently. Dust dislodged from the door frame and drifted down in thin sheets. The lock resisted for a second, then gave way with a dull thud. The door remained closed, but something had shifted. Luke gripped the metal handle and looked at Eleanor. "Are you ready?" She nodded, though her knees felt unsteady. "Open it." He pulled the door slowly. It moved only an inch, before stopping abruptly, as though something heavy pressed against it from the inside. Not blocking more, like leaning. Eleanor stepped closer, listening. At first, there was nothing, then a soft sound, like fabric brushing stone, then another. Slow, careful, too controlled to be settling dust. Eleanor felt her breath freeze. Something was inside. Luke's hand tightened on the handle, but he didn't pull further. He looked at Eleanor with wide, unsure eyes. "That wasn't the building," he whispered. Eleanor stepped forward almost involuntarily, drawn by both fear and a strange sense of inevitability. The manuscript felt warm against her hands now, as if reacting to whatever was on the other side of the wooden barrier. She pressed her ear lightly against the crack of the door. For a moment, there was only stillness. Then she heard it clearly. A breath. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. As if some man or something was standing right behind the door, listening just as she was. Eleanor jerked back, her heart hammering. The basement seemed to shrink around them, the air turning heavy and unmoving. Luke stepped backward, gripping the flashlight until his knuckles turned white. "Eleanor," he whispered. "We shouldn't be here." But Eleanor knew something else. Now something the manuscript had hinted. Something the seal had warned. Something the scribe had feared. Whatever the Brotherhood had hidden, whatever they had sealed away, it wasn't just knowledge. It was alive. and now I knew they were here. Eleanor left Boston before the sun had risen, taking the earliest train to New York. She sat by the window with her bag close to her chest, the copy of the manuscript pages carefully hidden between folders. The original lay locked in her apartment, but even the copy felt dangerous. She glanced frequently at the aisle, noticing every small movement. For most of the ride, the car was quiet. Commuters dozed, headphones muted the world, and the rhythmic hum of the train felt almost comforting. But Eleanor's mind was too alert to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the trembling handwriting of the medieval scribe, the desperate ink strokes, and those eerie words. They do not blink. Around midway through the trip, she felt something strange. The hairs on her arms rose, as though someone had taken a quiet seat behind her. She turned her head subtly. The seat row was empty, but the sensation remained as if an invisible weight lingered in the air. She tried to breathe slowly. "It's just nerves," she whispered. Just nerves. But she didn't believe herself. When the train finally arrived at the station, she stepped out quickly and scanned the crowd. New York's morning rush was a river of movement, people in suits, students with backpacks, travelers dragging rolling luggage. Everyone looked ordinary, but the feeling of being watched clung to her like a shadow refusing to detach. She made her way toward the address she had written down. Dr. Thomas Hargrave, Medieval, Historian Specialist in Lost Monastic Orders, retired professor. She had contacted him through an old academic email address. Not expecting a reply yet, he responded within hours. "Come in tomorrow, bring whatever you found." Eleanor didn't know if she should interpret that as interest or concern. His apartment was on the 4th floor of an old stone building. The hallway smelled faintly of books and something herbal, like dried rosemary. She knocked gently. The door opened only a few inches at first. A single dark eye studied her from behind the chain. "Eleanor Finch," a voice astrospy, but steady. "Yes," she said. "I brought the pages." The chain slid open. Dr. Hargrave stepped back and motioned her inside. He was tall, thin, with white hair that stood in soft waves as though time had run fingers through it too often. His apartment was filled with shelves floor to ceiling, dark wood overflowing with manuscripts, scrolls, and labeled boxers. He pointed her toward a small table near the window. "Sit," he said. "Let me see what you've brought." Eleanor placed her folder on the table and opened it. The copies of the medieval manuscript pages were arranged in order. Dr. Hargrave stood over them, leaning on the edge of the table. When he saw the first page, the one describing men without faces, his expression tightened. He reached out, but paused before touching the paper. "Where did you find this?" he asked softly. "In a sealed medieval manuscript at the Eastbourne collection," Eleanor said. "It wasn't catalogued. I don't think anyone's opened it in centuries." Hargrave nodded slowly, still staring at the page. "Yes, that would make sense. These kinds of documents weren't meant to be preserved. Not in any official record." Eleanor leaned forward. "You know what the seal means, don't you?" He exhaled through his nose. "Not the full meaning, but enough." He pulled a chair beside her and sat down. "In medieval Europe," he began, "there were rumors of an order not tied to royalty or the church. They weren't monks. They weren't soldiers. They were something else. Some called them the Faceless Scribes, though that name only appears in private journals, not official histories." Eleanor listened carefully, feeling her heartbeat slow so she could catch every word. "They were said to control information at the highest level," Hargrave continued. "If a king wanted a rival erased, they made it happen not by sword, but by ink. If the church wanted a narrative strengthened or softened, they adjusted chronicles. They didn't kill history's figures, they killed the record of them." Eleanor felt a chill crawl across her shoulders. "So they changed what the world remembered. They curated the past," he said. Carefully, quietly, completely. He picked up one copy and studied the handwriting, tracing the faint pressure marks with a finger that seemed too gentle for the gravity of the subject. "I've seen references over the years," he said. "A fragment here, a marginal note there. Always baggy, always fearful, and always followed by missing pages." Eleanor swallowed hard. The scribe who wrote this. He talks about being watched, about the Brotherhood of the Veil. Is that the same group? Hargrave hesitated. Possibly an earlier form of them, or a name the outside world used. Secret groups rarely call themselves by the names their enemies choose. She leaned closer. Do you think they were real? Hargrave looked at her with eyes that suddenly felt much older than his body. Miss Finch, in the 12th century there was a rebellion in a small region of France. Do you know who led it? No, she said. Neither does anyone else. Every chronicle from that region is missing the same 3 years of recorded history. Not damaged, not burned. Removed. He didn't need to say more. The implication was clear. Someone had reached deep into history and erased an entire chapter of truth. Eleanor felt her pulse hammering inside her chest. Dr. Hargrave, she whispered. Someone tried to hide this manuscript. Someone wanted it sealed forever. Why? He closed the folder gently and clasped his hands together. Because, he said, the moment something like this is opened, the moment someone reads it, the past begins to move again. And the ones who once shaped it, they do not like movement. Eleanor didn't breathe for a moment. My library's curator warned me, she said. He seemed genuinely afraid. He should be, Hargrave replied. He stood suddenly, walked to the door, and locked Italiano. Then he turned the deadbolt. Then the chain. Eleanor watched him, confused and frightened. When he returned to the table, he lowered his voice to almost a whisper. Miss Finch, he said carefully, if you opened that seal? He paused. The room felt suffocatingly still. Someone already knows. Eleanor's breath caught. The hallway outside creaked just once, like a single footstep that didn't belong to the building's natural sounds. Hargrave's eyes flicked toward the door. Neither of them said another word. Eleanor woke before dawn, long before her alarm, with a strange feeling that something in the room had been watching her sleep. Her apartment was dimly lit by the early gray of morning, the silence sharp enough to feel like a small pressure on her ears. The manuscript lay closed on her desk, exactly where she'd left it. Yet somehow the air around it felt different, still charged, still unsettled. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples. Her dreams had been fragmented. Shadows moving behind walls, whispers slipping between pages, and the unsettling sensation of someone standing just outside her line of sight. It left her with a heaviness she couldn't quite shake, but she also knew she couldn't avoid the manuscript. By late morning, she was back at the Eastbourne Library. The building looked ordinary from the outside, its stone structure unchanged. But Eleanor noticed something she had never paid attention to before: how the windows reflected more darkness than light, even on a clear day. She wondered whether it had always been like that, or whether her eyes were simply adjusting to the shadows of the manuscript's world. Inside, the halls were quiet. Too quiet. The usual soft murmurs of researchers, the turning of pages, the faint rumble of carts all missing. She walked past shelves of early European history, then past medieval theology, and finally into the special collections room, where the smell of old paper wrapped around her like a familiar cloak. She placed her bag on the table and opened the manuscript again. Her fingers hesitated for a second before turning the next page. The writing on this page was different, not shaky, not rushed, calm, almost resigned. Those who fear the Brotherhood believe them to be faceless. They are not. They have faces like ours, hands like ours, breath like ours. What they do not have are names. These are taken from them the moment they join. Their pasts are erased so thoroughly that even their memories turn to shadow. Eleanor felt her heart tighten. This wasn't mythology. This was systematic. To become one of them is to become a ghost among the living. They walk in courts and monasteries. They advise kings. They rewrite chronicles. They change not the events of history, but the record of those events. They decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. Eleanor leaned back slightly, absorbing the meaning. A group that altered history not by creating new events, but by editing recorded ones would be nearly impossible to detect. They could have shaped centuries of knowledge without ever being seen. She turned the page, I write now with a certainty I did not have before. They know what I am doing. Their silence grows louder. When the candles burn low, I hear footsteps beyond the wall. They do not rush. They do not knock. They wait. A faint tremor passed through Eleanor's hand. The scribe had written those words in fear, but not panic. It was as though he had accepted his fate, understanding that he would not outrun them. Eleanor swallowed and read on. If this reaches another age, know that they will still be there. The Brotherhood does not die. It replaces itself. One nameless man for another. One shadow for another. They endure because they remove every trace of error. Every mistake is corrected. Every threat erased. The last word on the page was written more heavily, as if the quill had pressed into the parchment with force. Erased. Eleanor stared at the word for a long time. It seemed impossibly fresh, as though the ink had been set down only minutes before. She felt a faint tremor in her chest, not exactly fear, but something close. The sense that the manuscript wasn't simply a record of the past, but a mirror reflecting into her own world. She read the next line. And if you, reader from a distant era, hold this page in your hands, then know this. You, too, are being watched. The sentence cut through her like ice. She closed the manuscript halfway, gripping the edges of the pages, breathing slowly. It couldn't be literal, she told herself. It was metaphorical, a scribe dramatizing his fear. Medieval scribes often used heightened language when describing danger, yet the words stayed in her mind. You, too, are being watched. She exhaled and forced herself to keep reading, but before she could turn the next page, a soft sound echoed through the silent room. A slow, deliberate shuffle. Eleanor's head snapped up. Someone was standing at the far end of the collections room. A tall figure dressed in a long, dark coat, unmoving, watching her. His face was shadowed by the angle of the light. She couldn't see his features, only the outline of a man who seemed still to be casual. Her breath caught. She blinked once, and when her eyes opened, the figure had stepped slightly closer, not much, just enough to make her pulse quicken. She looked around the room. No one else. The figure did not move again, but Eleanor felt the pressure of his presence like a hand on her shoulder. She closed the manuscript slowly, keeping her eyes on him. Her fingers tightened around the edges as if the pages themselves were a lifeline. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. She didn't speak, didn't stand, didn't even breathe loudly, because something inside her said, this wasn't a curious researcher. This wasn't a librarian, and this wasn't an accident. Someone had come for the manuscript, and as she sat frozen in the silent room, Eleanor finally understood why the scribe had written those desperate warnings. Some shadows do not fade with time. Some footsteps travel centuries, and some watchers were never meant to be seen. The morning light eased into Eleanor's apartment slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. She woke with a start, the remnants of uneasy dreams clinging to her like damp mist. Her first instinct was to reach for the manuscript, which still lay on her desk across the room. Nothing looked out of place from her bed yet. Something felt undeniably wrong. She got up quietly. The floor felt colder than usual under her feet. Every step toward the desk carried that silent heaviness she had begun associating with the manuscript itself, as if it radiated some invisible presence that filled the room without ever revealing itself. When she reached the desk, she froze. Her chair had moved. Last night, she remembered pushing it in. She was certain of it. She had a habit of keeping things perfectly aligned. Now the chair stood slightly away from the desk, angled just enough to suggest that someone had sat in it recently. Her heart tightened. She looked around the apartment. Nothing else seemed disturbed. No drawers opened, no books scattered, no sign of intrusion. The windows were locked. The door bolts were in place, exactly as she had left them. For a long moment, she simply stood there, trying to slow her breathing. Rational explanations fought for space in her mind. Maybe she had forgotten. Maybe she had pushed the chair without realizing it. Maybe she had been more tired than she thought, but her body rejected the excuses before her mind finished forming them. She knew how she left this room. She sat down slowly, trying to calm herself, and opened the manuscript. The pages felt slightly different beneath her fingers, as if they had been turned, touched, or pressed by hands other than her own. She flipped through the sections she had read the previous night, scanning the familiar lines. Then she stopped. There was a paragraph she did not recognize. It sat nestled between two lines she was certain she had read multiple times. She stared at the ink, the tight handwriting, the slightly faded strokes. The style was identical. The age of the parchment was identical. Everything suggested this paragraph had been here since the manuscript was written. But she absolutely knew it had not been present yesterday. The paragraph read, "There are moments when they stand beside you, though your eyes insist upon seeing nothing. They breathe without breath, watch without gaze. If you feel them once, you will feel them forever, for they bind themselves to those who turn the forbidden pages." Eleanor's whole body chilled. She leaned back, gripping the edges of the chair as quietly as she could, though there was no one to hear. Or perhaps there was. The manuscript's warning did not feel symbolic anymore. It felt literal, personal. She closed the manuscript, unable to look at it for another second, and stepped away. Her apartment felt smaller now, as if the walls tightened with each breath she took. She scanned the room again, more carefully this time. The slight slant of a picture frame on the wall, the way her desk lamp seemed turned a fraction of an inch to the side, the faint mark on the floor near the chair like something she didn't remember noticing before. These weren't accidents. Something had been here. She dashed to her laptop, needing distraction, needing control. The familiar glow of the screen felt comforting for half a second. Then she noticed a new folder on the desktop. It was named simply. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't created this. Her hands hovered over the trackpad for a moment before she finally clicked the folder. Inside was a single text file with no name. She opened Italiano. There was only one line. "You are not meant to break the seal." Eleanor slammed the laptop shut so suddenly the sound echoed off the apartment walls. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She looked around once more, forcing herself not to panic, trying to understand. Someone hacked a computer. Someone entered her apartment. Someone touched the manuscript. But it couldn't be just some person. Not with everything else that had happened. Not with the whisper she had heard in the library. Not with the paragraph that appeared overnight in the manuscript. Despite every scholarly rule she had ever learned, the medieval scribe had written of the Brotherhood men without faces. Watchers who rewrote history. She used to think the writer spoke metaphorically, exaggerating dangers or speaking in coded fear. Now she wasn't so sure. She returned to the manuscript with slow, reluctant steps. The wax seal lay beside it like a small, mute warning she had ignored. She opened the manuscript again, reluctantly reading beneath the newly appeared paragraph. The next line sent a fresh chill down her spine. "Once the seal is broken, the watchers know your name." Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the book again. The sunlight in the apartment suddenly felt weaker, as if struggling to push back the lingering shadows. She sat perfectly still, listening. At first, she heard nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. But then, just at the edge of her hearing, something shifted. A faint displacement of air. Not a whisper. Not a voice. A presence, invisible. Close. She didn't turn. She didn't breathe. The manuscript's warnings were no longer stories. Whatever the Brotherhood of the Veil had once been, whatever power they had used in the Middle Ages, had not died with time. It had adapted, grown silent, and waited. And last night, when Eleanor broke the seal, she had awakened something that had never stopped watching. She sat absolutely still, knowing one thing with painful clarity. None of this was an accident. Something had finally noticed her. The room felt smaller than before, as if the walls had crept closer during the night. Eleanor sat at Leon's desk with the manuscript open between them, its fragile pages illuminated by a single desk lamp. The light cast long shadows across the edges, giving the words a trembling outline, as though the past itself shivered under their gaze. Leon turned another page carefully. "We're close to the end of the scribe's testimony," he murmured. You can feel it. Eleanor nodded. There was a certain heaviness in the writing now, a weight that suggested the author had known he was running out of time. The ink strokes had grown uneven, the spacing tighter. The hand clearly rushed. Whoever he was, he must have written these lines with fear at his back. Leon leaned closer, squinting. Wait, look at this. The next paragraph began with a line unlike the others. If these words survive my breath, let the witness speak when I cannot. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. A witness. He wasn't alone. Seems like it, Leon said. Maybe someone he trusted. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She imagined a medieval room, dimly lit by a single candle. The scribe writing frantically while another frightened soul waited nearby. The idea felt heartbreakingly human. Leon read aloud softly, letting the centuries-old words settle into the room. He has no title, no wealth, no protection. He is not of the council, nor of the cloister, nor of the brotherhood. They will overlook him because they believe only the powerful can threaten them. They do not understand that truth can survive in the hands of the unnoticed. Eleanor whispered. A commoner kept the final part of the truth. Leon nodded. That's why they never found it. The scribe continued. I entrust him with the last memory, the last detail they fear most. I cannot write it, for they watch the quill as they watch the sword, but he will carry it far, beyond the lands they rule. If faith is kind, he will pass it to a land they have never reached. Eleanor's hands grew cold. Leo met her eyes. A land they never reached. That could mean anywhere outside Europe. Or, Eleanor said quietly, it could mean here. The thoughts settled between them like dust. For the first time, the manuscript hinted that the conspiracy didn't simply die in Europe. It might have traveled across oceans through a single unnamed witness. A man with no power, no rank, no place in official records, but someone the scribe believed could outwit the Brotherhood because no one would think to silence him. Leon leaned back in his chair. So this witness carried something, not a manuscript, something unwritten. A story, Eleanor said. A memory. They turned the page. The writing was nearly illegible now. Ink smudged, as though the scribe's hand had been shaking uncontrollably. If I fall, let it be known I did not fall alone. He has seen what they hide. He has heard what they whisper, and he will go where they cannot follow. Then, abruptly, the handwriting changed. The strokes grew jagged, uneven almost, as if written in the dark, or by someone else entirely. They are at the door. A blot of ink marked the bottom corner, smeared as though the quill had slipped. Leon whispered. This is the last moment of his life. Eleanor felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She imagined the writer hearing footsteps outside his room, hearing whispered commands, knowing the end had come. And in that final terrifying moment, he still tried to leave behind a warning for someone centuries in the future. The page ended abruptly. No signature, no farewell. Just silence. Eleanor closed the manuscript gently. We need to find the witness, or at least the trail he left. Leon reached for a folder sitting on the edge of the desk. I've been doing some digging. Remember that obscure shipping record I found yesterday? The one from the late 1300s? Eleanor nodded. It listed a passenger who traveled alone across the North Atlantic. Leon tapped the folder. No name, just a note beside it, at the request of the cloistered scribe. That phrase appears nowhere else in the archives. They spoke of a plague that had begun in the East. They predicted it would reach Europe within months, instead of preparing to protect the cities. They discussed how the chaos could be used to remove families and factions that opposed them. They viewed suffering not as tragedy, but as opportunity. Eleanor's breath tightened. They planned to use the plague, she whispered, not stop it. Theo rubbed his forehead. We always talk about medieval plagues as random catastrophes, but if groups like this shaped how help was distributed, it would explain why certain regions suffered more than others, she finished. The scribe had written that he tried to leave before the council ended, but he was forced to remain when a final ritual began, one not included in any official record, one that terrified him enough to leave shaky ink blots on the parchment. Then they came the Watchers, They entered without sound, as if their footsteps chose not to disturb the air. Their robes were darker, their faces covered not by cloth but by smooth plates that reflected no light. I do not know if they were men. I do not know if they breathed. But the council members bowed to them, and even the torches dimmed as they approached. Eleanor had to pause. The room felt colder, though she knew it was just the weight of the description pressing into her thoughts. The Watchers, Theo said softly. He mentioned them before, but this is different. He saw them, Eleanor read. On a voice quieter, they circled the room without speaking. One of them stopped behind a council member who had questioned a decision earlier. The Watcher placed a hand upon his shoulder. The man froze, then slumped forward. No wound, no cry, no breath. The others did not look shocked. Theo's hands tensed on the edge of the desk, so the Brotherhood had enforcers. Silent ones. Or something worse, Eleanor whispered. The scribe concluded this portion with a line filled with bitterness and despair. Truth dies in that chamber. I must write what I can before the Watchers find me, for they do not guard knowledge. Verace Italiano. Eleanor leaned back slowly, letting the words settle. Her heartbeat felt loud in her ears. It wasn't just the content of the manuscript, it was the scribe's palpable dread. The weight of someone who had seen his world reshaped itself in front of him, powerless to stop it. Theo stared at the manuscript with a troubled expression. If the Watchers were real, then maybe the Brotherhood had a way of identifying threats. People who knew too much. People like him. People like us, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. The room grew still. They both knew she wasn't wrong. Whoever the Brotherhood had been, whatever remnants of them might still exist, would not want this manuscript resurfacing. Theo's gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights glowed faintly through the curtains. Do you think anyone today knows about this? I mean, really knows. Not myths or academic footnotes, but the actual truth. Eleanor folded her arms tightly, as though bracing herself against a cold wind. If they do, they've spent centuries making sure no one else does. She turned back to the manuscript, tracing a fingertip over the final line on the page. If you are reading this in an age I will never see, know that the council will survive longer than kings, longer than empires, longer even than the written truth. They thrive in silence. Beware what you seek, because they listen from the shadows. Theo closed his eyes as the weight of the words settled between them. He knew he was going to die, he said quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied, but he also knew someone would eventually find this. She looked at Theo with a mixture of fear and resolve. We're getting too close, she said, close to something that was never meant for us. And though the room was silent, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that somewhere, perhaps in the shifting quiet of the hallway outside, or in the stillness of the night, something was listening, watching, waiting. Eleanor had traveled far from the quiet streets of Massachusetts to the misty hills of southern Europe. The small town she had arrived in seemed to exist in another century, its cobbled streets winding between stone houses covered with ivy, and the smell of damp earth lingering in the narrow alleys. She was not here for tourism. She was chasing shadows, fragments of a truth long hidden. The town library, smaller and older than any she had seen in America, was tucked into a corner of the main square. Its oak door was worn from centuries of hands pushing it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, parchment, and something older, almost like the faint temps of iron. Eleanor felt the familiar thrill of discovery, tempered by the heavy stillness of the place. She had come with a single lead. A journal that had been preserved in a local archive, attributed to a knight exiled during the 14th century. According to whispers in academic circles, he had crossed paths with the Brotherhood of the Veil, the secret society she had just begun to understand. If the manuscript she had found in Massachusetts hinted at hidden manipulation of history, this journal might confirm it firsthand. She asked the archivist, a quietman in his 70s with eyes that seemed to have seen too much if she could see the knight's writings. He hesitated, then nodded. Few dare touch this. But you may, with care. Eleanor carefully opened the journal. The pages were brittle, smelling faintly of mildew and candle wax. She read the first entry. I write from the shadow of exile, for they do not allow my presence in lands I once called home. I have seen their faces, though no man may name them. They move as whispers, appearing only where the truth is fragile. The handwriting was elegant, yet hurried. Eleanor could almost feel the weight of fear pressing down through the centuries. I was once a knight of some renown. I swore loyalty to kings, to codes, to justice. Yet I found myself pursued, questioned, watched, even by those who claimed to serve the light. It was then I realized the Brotherhood of the Veil does not serve kings or lords. They serve only themselves, shaping the course of history as they see fit. She turned the page and read more. I witnessed councils that decided fates of men and women without their knowledge. I saw scribes vanish, libraries sealed, chronicles rewritten. I dared to speak once, and I was punished, not with chains, nor with blade, but with exile. I wanted lands foreign and familiar, my voice unheard. Eleanor could hardly believe the words. The knight was describing exactly the kind of organization her manuscript hinted that the Brotherhood was real, active, and merciless. Unlike her manuscript, though, this journal felt lived and personal. The fear was tangible, the courage brittle, and the consequences immediate. I must warn those who find these words. The Brotherhood watches, not as soldiers or priests, but as shadows in the halls of power. They leave no sign but the absence of truth. Speak, and you risk what I have risked. A life erased. She paused, letting the inked words sink in. The past, so distant in time, had never felt so close. She traced the faint lines with her fingers. Every page seemed to vibrate with the memory of someone who had truly walked in danger, who had understood the depth of secrecy that lay behind the veil. The next entry was dated years later, from a location Eleanor could not identify. I am old, yet I carry their shadow with me. I speak of them only in whispers to the walls of this world. One day, someone may find this journal. Perhaps they will understand. Perhaps not. But si notis. Those who think themselves beyond notice are watched. History is a river, but they divert its flow at will. Eleanor leaned back, her mind spinning. The journal was more than a record, it was a warning. The knight's fear and exile were not isolated. There were evidence of a system that could reach across countries, manipulate events, and erase those who opposed it. The Brotherhood had been real, dangerous, and invisible to the world for centuries. A chill crept along her spine. She realized she was no longer just a reader. She was a witness, pulled into the continuum of secrecy that had claimed the night. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She was following in the footsteps of those who had vanished, whose voices were silenced. As she read further, a final note stood out, nearly fading with age. To you who have found this, understand that courage alone is not enough. Knowledge carries a burden. Beware the unseen eyes, and remember the veiled never sleep. Eleanor closed the journal slowly, her fingers lingering on the worn leather. The room felt colder now, as if the shadows had gathered to listen. She had glimpsed the world behind the veil, and the implications were staggering. She had to continue. But she also knew that pursuing this knowledge meant stepping into a web that had claimed lives before hers. Yet despite the fear, curiosity burned brighter. Eleanor knew that what had been hidden would not remain so, and that the knight's warnings were both a guide and a challenge. She was part of a story centuries in the making, and the Brotherhood had not gone away. They were still out there, their legacy etched into every suppressed page of history. Eleanor sat in silence for a long time, feeling the weight of centuries pressing in from every corner of the small library. The wind rattled the window pane, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and old stone. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world moved on, oblivious to the hidden currents that shaped it. She felt a mixture of resolve and dread. The knight's testimony had confirmed what her manuscript suggested. The Brotherhood of the Veil was no myth, and if she wanted to uncover the full truth, she would have to navigate the dangerous spaces between history and secrecy, between shadows and revelation. Eleanor opened the journal once more. Her eyes fell on a single line, written in almost trembling script. They see everything, but they cannot touch what is truly determined by those who seek the light. You, reader, may yet turn the tide, if you dare. She took a deep breath and whispered to the empty room, "I dare." And for the first time since she had opened the Massachusetts manuscript, Eleanor felt that she had truly crossed into a world that did not want to be known a world, where history itself had been manipulated, and only those brave enough to follow the hidden traces could hope to see the full picture. The veil was no longer an abstraction. It was a living, watching force, and she had placed herself directly beneath its gaze. Eleanor had always imagined forests as tranquil, timeless spaces where one could escape the weight of the modern world. But the forest she approached on the outskirts of the small European town was nothing like that. The path leading into it was narrow, flanked by ancient oaks whose twisted branches stretched like the fingers of a sleeping giant. Mist clung to the ground, drifting through the trees in slow, deliberate waves. A faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves hung in the air, so thick that it felt almost physical. According to the old manuscripts she carried, this forest had been known to locals for centuries as the Vanishing Roads, a place where travelers sometimes lost their way completely. The medieval knight had warned of paths that seemed to shift, trees that moved subtly when no one was watching, and the whispers of those who had disappeared long ago. Eleanor had dismissed it as legend at first, but now, standing at the edge of the dense foliage, she felt a shiver of apprehension. She stepped onto the leaf-covered path, boots crunching softly. Every step seemed to absorb sound, making the forest quieter than it should have been. Shadows clung to the trunks of the trees, dense and moving, though she knew the wind was barely stirring. Eleanor's hand instinctively brushed against the strap of her satchel, which carried both the Massachusetts manuscript and the knight's journal. They were her only guides in this place, though their guidance was cryptic, full of warnings rather than directions. The deeper she walked, the more disoriented she felt. Paths forked in ways that made no sense, looping back toward familiar points she had already passed. Every turn looked both new and familiar. Her pulse quickened, and she paused to breathe, trying to regain a sense of direction. The forest seemed to respond faint. Whispers floated through the air, voices in a language she did not recognize, rushing past her ears like the sighing of leaves. She could not tell whether they were real or echoes of her imagination. Time became slippery. Minutes stretched into hours, or so. Eleanor noticed strange patterns in the undergrowth trails of crushed leaves that vanished when she turned to look directly at them. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, and at one point, she swore she saw a figure standing behind a tree, only to vanish when she blinked. Panic threatened, but she forced herself to walk slowly, counting her steps, grounding herself in the reality she could verify. At a small clearing, she found a stone, half buried in moss, carved with a symbol that matched the mysterious seal from her Massachusetts manuscript. She knelt, touching the indentations with her fingertips. A chill ran up her arm. This place, whatever it was, connected directly to the Brotherhood. They had left their mark centuries ago, perhaps as a warning or as a guide for someone willing to follow the trail. She pulled the manuscripts from her satchel and opened them on the stone. The knight's journal mentioned landmarks that shifted like illusions, streams that looped back, trees that seemed older than time, and clearings that appeared only to those meant to see them. She realized that every warning had been literal. The forest was designed to confuse, delay, and test anyone who entered, but it was more than a physical maze. It was a challenge to perception and resolve. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes for Eleanor noticed a faint glimmer through the mist. A narrow path, almost invisible, leading deeper into the forest. It did not appear on any map, and the manuscripts offered no direct instruction. But instinct, sharpened by months of research and the knight's haunting words, told her this was the correct route. Every nerve in her body told her to hesitate, to turn back, but the pull of the truth was irresistible. She moved cautiously, aware that the forest seemed alive, watching her, testing her resolve. A whisper brushed her ear, just audible, as if someone or something was breathing words directly into her mind. She could not understand them, yet the tone carried warning, encouragement, and curiosity all at once. Eleanor forced herself to focus on the path, counting each step, Measuring her bearings by the landmarks the manuscripts had hinted at, a fallen oak with roots resembling twisted hands, a stream that flowed uphill for a few paces, a ring of mushrooms marking the edge of a hollow. By the time she emerged from the densest part of the forest, Eleanor was exhausted, but exhilarated. She had traversed the vanishing roads and lived to tell it, guided by both the manuscripts and her own intuition. The clearing she now found herself in was bathed in a soft, almost ethereal light. It was quiet, yet vibrant with history and memory. Stones carved with symbols, faint carvings in the bark of ancient trees, and Moscovad ruins suggested that this place had been used for rituals, gatherings, or secret meetings, long forgotten by ordinary maps and histories. Eleanor knelt again, brushing her fingers over a carved indentation that resembled the seals she had seen before. She understood, for the first time, that the forest was not merely a physical location. It was a repository of secrets, a place designed to protect knowledge and to test the worthiness of those who sought it. The Knight's Journal had warned of trials, and she now realized that this was one. The forest itself was a living guardian of history, revealing itself only to those who could navigate its illusions, interpret its signs, and persevere despite fear. As she sat in a fallen log, catching her breath, Eleanor reflected on what she had learned. The vanishing roads were more than a legend. They were a deliberate construct of time, memory, and secrecy, and she understood that the Brotherhood of the Veil had chosen this place carefully. Here, knowledge could survive for centuries, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave and perceptive enough to find it. She opened the Massachusetts manuscript and the Knight's Journal, comparing the descriptions with her. Every line seemed to resonate with the place, every warning a signpost she had followed without fully realizing it. Eleanor felt a mixture of relief, awe, and trepidation. She was closer to understanding the Brotherhood, but the forest had reminded her that this path was not merely about discovery, it was about endurance, perception, and courage. The sun, filtered through the dense canopy, began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Eleanor knew she would have to spend the night here. Yet she felt a strange calm. The forest had tested her, and she had passed, but she also understood that this was only the beginning. The vanishing roads were a portal into deeper mysteries, and the Brotherhood's influence extended far beyond what even these manuscripts hinted at. Eleanor leaned back against the trunk of an ancient oak, opening the journal once more. The Knight's words echoed in her mind. They see everything, but they cannot touch what is truly determined by those who seek the light. She closed her eyes and let the soft mist surround her, feeling the weight of centuries of hidden knowledge pressing gently against her senses. She had survived the first test of the forest. The next steps would be harder, more dangerous, and more revealing. But she was ready, and she knew that the path ahead, though uncertain, would lead her closer to the truth the world had been denied for centuries. Eleanor left the vanishing roads behind, stepping into a clearing where the mist thinned, revealing jagged cliffs and a river winding like silver thread through the valley below. She had traveled far, and yet a strange sense of being followed lingered at the edge of her awareness. The manuscripts she carried offered no warnings about what awaited her next, but instinct told her that she was not alone. She could feel it in the subtle shifts of the air, the brush of unseen eyes, and the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of leaves where there should have been none. The figure appeared without warning. At first, she saw only movement, a shadow darting between the rocks. Too fast, too deliberate to be an animal. Then he emerged fully, a tall, lean man, dressed in clothing that seemed both ancient and practical, his eyes sharp and reflective in the fading light. He carried a bow across his back and a quiver of arrows at his hip. But it was not his weaponry that unnerved her. It was the stillness, the sense that he had been watching her for hours or perhaps days. "You are far from the village," the man said without greeting, his voice low and measured, carrying authority yet no hostility. "Few enter these paths alone." "I could say the same of you," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the thrum of adrenaline through her veins. He smiled faintly. "Names are not important. I am called the Hunter." His gaze fixed on her, unwavering, and there was a weight behind it that made her stomach tighten. "Some say I never sleep. Those who seek what should remain hidden eventually find me." Eleanor studied him carefully. He seemed entirely human, yet there was something uncanny in his presence. A quiet intensity that suggested he had seen more than he should have, and perhaps survived because of it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Yet, everything. You carry knowledge that many would prefer remain buried. The Brotherhood of the Veil does not forgive curiosity. Not even yours." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had anticipated danger, yes, but she had not expected direct confrontation. She tightened her grip on the manuscripts, feeling the weight of centuries in her hands. "I seek only truth," she said. "I do not seek conflict." "Truth is rarely harmless," the hunter said. He began walking alongside her, silent, except for the soft crunch of her boots and the occasional whisper of wind. "The Brotherhood manipulates more than chronicles. They guide kings, control scholars, rewrite events, and silence those who notice. I've spent decades tracing their patterns, marking the footprints left in shadows." Eleanor's curiosity surged, mingled with unease. "Decades?" she asked. "You're saying you've been following them all this time?" "I follow what survives," he said. "The Veiled are patient, meticulous. But they leave traces, subtle and often overlooked. I've learned to read them, to anticipate them, to survive." She felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The manuscripts, the knight's journal, and now this hunter spoke of the same invisible web that had stretched across Europe and, perhaps, the world. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, cautiously. "I am not helping," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "I am observing, testing. The path to the truth is not open to the naive or the faint-hearted. You must prove yourself capable of understanding without succumbing to fear, for fear invites mistakes, and mistakes are deadly." They walked in silence for a while, the fading light casting long shadows across the terrain. Eleanor noticed strange patterns, footprints in places no one should have walked, trees marked with faint scratches in geometric forms, and a series of canstone markers that seemed to appear just ahead of her steps, then vanish when she looked back. "It is a place of trials," the hunter said, breaking the silence. "Every step, every choice, is a test. You are being watched, not just by me, but by those who do not sleep. You must learn to move through shadows without becoming one, to read signs where there are none, and to carry your own judgment. Above all else." Eleanor listened intently, realizing that his words were both caution and guidance. This was no longer simply a quest for historical truth. It was a journey through danger, perception, and endurance. Every instinct she had cultivated over months of research, the attention to detail, the patience, the resilience would be put to the test. And she understood that the hunter himself was the embodiment of those tests, a sentinel of knowledge, guiding and judging in equal measure. As night fell, the forest and cliffs around them grew darker, the shapes more difficult to discern. Eleanor felt her nerves tighten, yet a strange calm settled over her. She was learning to move through the world as the Veiled intended, aware, alert, and attentive to every detail. The hunter's presence, though unnerving, provided a framework, a way to measure her own abilities against the hidden threats she would inevitably face. Finally, the hunter paused, pointing toward a faint glow through the trees. "That is where your next challenge begins. Enter with caution. Observe closely, and remember, the Veiled see far more than you know, but they cannot predict courage." Eleanor nodded, clutching her manuscripts. She had seen shadows, followed trails that should not exist, and survived the vanishing roads. Now, she faced something even more complex, a living test designed to push her limits, and a guide who could not be fully trusted. Yet for the first time, she felt ready. The hunter watched her for a long moment, silent and vigilant. Then he stepped back into the darkness, vanishing as abruptly as he had appeared. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling both relief and apprehension, and stepped forward toward the glow. She was no longer simply reading history. She was part of it, moving through the spaces where the Brotherhood had left their marks, where knowledge waited to be claimed by those brave enough to find it. And she knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. Eleanor stepped cautiously, toward the faint glow she had seen through the trees. The light led her into a narrow clearing, where jagged rocks and ancient boulders formed a natural amphitheater. The ground was covered with moss and fallen leaves, but beneath them, she noticed faint impressions in the dirt line. Circles and geometric patterns carved into the stone itself. Symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if they remembered the hands that had etched them centuries ago. She knelt, brushing the moss aside, and traced the carvings with her fingers. Every line was deliberate, every circle precise. They were not random marks left by nature, but carefully designed indicators, a map encoded in shapes and angles. Eleanor realized these symbols must correspond to instructions left by those who understood the Brotherhood of the Veil, a silent code designed to guide or perhaps mislead anyone bold enough to follow it. As she examined the stones, a soft sound reached her ears, a whispering, subtle yet distinct, moving through the air like a current. Eleanor froze, straining to catch the words. It was not a language she could comprehend. It wasn't a human voice, yet it was intentional, rhythmic, and laden with meaning. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The manuscripts had warned her of hidden presences and veiled watchers, but this was her first encounter with a sound that seemed alive, carrying messages from beyond her understanding. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. The Massachusetts manuscript and the Knight's Journal were her guides, but she needed to interpret what lay before her. The symbols on the stones corresponded with passages she had read. Circles marking points of danger, triangles indicating paths, and lines suggesting movement or sequence. It was a trail, one that required careful reading, attention, and courage. The whispering grew slightly louder, weaving through the trees and stones, but when she tried to follow it, it shifted, as though teasing her, testing her ability to discern what was real. Eleanor felt a thrill of fear mixed with excitement. She was not merely observing history anymore, she was navigating it. The forest, the glow, the symbols, and the whispers formed a living puzzle, challenging her to read between the lines of time itself. As she traced a particularly intricate pattern on a stone slab, she noticed faint scratches that matched the seal from the Massachusetts manuscript. 3 small indentations, almost imperceptible unless viewed with intention, connected the carvings to the manuscripts she carried. Eleanor's heart pounded. The Brotherhood's influence was present here, etched into every surface, guiding those capable of seeing. She was both observer and participant now, moving through a space layered with history and hidden intelligence. The whispers seemed to respond to her movements. They were not malevolent, yet they carried urgency, as if the forest itself wanted to ensure she understood the signs correctly. Eleanor paused, mapping the symbols in her mind and cross-referencing them with the journal. Every step she had taken, every mark she had traced, felt like a dialogue between herself and the past, a test to measure her attention, courage, and insight. She realized something profound. This place was not merely physical. It was a repository of knowledge and memory, encoded into shapes, sounds, and space. The Brotherhood had left more than manuscripts. They had left living architecture, a trail that only someone sufficiently determined and perceptive could follow. And Eleanor, for all her fear and exhaustion, was proving capable. The glow she had followed now revealed a small stone pedestal in the center of the clearing. Atop it rested a shallow basin, its surface etched with intricate patterns identical to those in the manuscripts. Eleanor approached, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the carvings. She could feel a faint vibration through her fingertips, as if the stones themselves remembered the hands that had touched them centuries ago. The whispering intensified, circling her like a soft wind, and she realized that the voice was guiding her, encouraging her to trace the correct patterns, to move with attention, to respect the rhythm of the hidden design. Each mark she traced felt like unlocking a memory, revealing fragments of a truth buried for centuries. The forest, the symbols, and the whispers were aligned, forming a living narrative that demanded participation, not passive observation. Eleanor paused, breathing deeply. The manuscripts had prepared her for historical knowledge, but nothing could have prepared her for this. She understood now that the Brotherhood had designed not only a repository of hidden information, but a living test one that merged intellect, courage, and intuition. Every scholar who had failed this challenge had left the trail, unseen and unrecorded. Every observer who succeeded had become part of the living memory of the forest, woven into the hidden tapestry of the Brotherhood. For the first time, Eleanor embraced her role fully. She was no longer simply a seeker of knowledge. She was an active participant, reading, interpreting, and moving through a space layered with time, secrecy, and intelligence. She realized that each whisper, each line, each shadow was a test of her perception and resilience, and she was ready to continue. Understanding that every correct step brought her closer to the ultimate truth the Brotherhood had tried so hard to conceal. As she traced the final pattern on the basin, a faint light glimmered within the carved lines, illuminating a sequence that matched the manuscripts. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She was beginning to see the connections, the logic hidden within the seeming chaos. The whispers calmed, almost approvingly, as though acknowledging her insight. Eleanor knew then that she had passed the first real test of the forest and the hidden guardians of knowledge, but she also understood, with a mix of awe and trepidation, that deeper trials awaited. The Brotherhood's reach, encoded in whispers, shadows, and symbols, stretched farther than she could yet imagine, and the path ahead would demand not only courage, but clarity, focus, and unyielding resolve. With her manuscripts held close, Eleanor stepped back from the pedestal. The forest seemed to breathe around her, the mist swirling gently as the whispers faded, leaving a profound silence. She felt the weight of centuries of hidden knowledge pressing on her consciousness, yet for the first time, she felt capable of carrying it forward. The path ahead was still uncertain. The challenges would grow, the dangers would increase, and the truth would demand more than she had ever given before. But Eleanor Finch was no longer merely following history. She was moving within it, navigating its hidden currents, and becoming an essential part of the story the world had forgotten. She whispered to herself, "I understand now. I'm ready." And as the mist shifted around her, the forest seemed to nod in silent acknowledgement, marking her as one who had passed the first true test of the Brotherhood's enduring design. Eleanor moved through the final stretch of the forest with a sense of cautious anticipation. The mist had begun to thin, revealing crumbling stone walls rising from the undergrowth like the skeleton of a long-forgotten fortress. She had reached the edge of the ancient ruins she had been searching for, an abandoned structure mentioned in the manuscripts and hinted at in the Knightess Journal. According to the texts, it was a place where the Brotherhood had once gathered, leaving layers of knowledge and symbols embedded in every corner. The doorway ahead was fractured, the wooden frame warped and splintered, as though centuries of neglect had tried to erase it. Eleanor hesitated before stepping inside, her hand resting on the edge of the broken frame. The air was heavy with dust and decay, yet beneath it, she could sense the faint pulse of preserved history, a heartbeat of memory that had survived despite time and abandonment. Inside, the rooms were dark and silent, lit only by the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through cracks in the walls. Every surface was marked with symbols similar to those she had encountered in the forest. Circles, triangles, and the faint, almost imperceptible impressions of the seal she had studied back in The walls themselves seemed to hum with an energy she could neither name nor see, a subtle presence that followed her with every step. She traced her fingers along the carvings, reading them as if they were lines of text. Some were warnings, others were instructions, guiding her through the ruined halls. Eleanor could feel the Brotherhood's meticulous planning in every detail. They had anticipated anyone seeking their secrets, and had left a trail that demanded careful observation, intellect, and courage. As she moved deeper into the building, she noticed shadows that did not belong to her, shifting against the walls as if they had life of their own. Her pulse quickened, but she reminded herself to breathe, keeping focus on the manuscripts in her satchel. Every step seemed to echo unnaturally, a reminder that she was not alone. Something unseen tracked her movements, testing her awareness and resolve. At the center of the ruins, she found a larger chamber, its floor covered in mosaics depicting sequences of symbols intertwined with human figures. A stone pedestal stood in the middle, and atop it rested a small collection of parchments, carefully folded and tied with a thread that had resisted decay. Eleanor approached slowly, aware that the slightest misstep could trigger unforeseen consequences. She opened the first parchment with reverent caution. The handwriting was unmistakably medieval, precise, and deliberate. It was a record of rituals, movements, and coded instructions, the operational notes of the Brotherhood itself. Eleanor's eyes widened as she realized that she was holding documents that the organization had once used to coordinate their influence, to guide the flow of knowledge, power, and secrecy across generations. A soft sound made her glance. A faint scraping, almost a whisper of movement from the far side of the chamber. Eleanor froze. The air felt charged, as if the building itself were alert to her presence. She was alone, and yet she was not. Something in the shadows tracked her, patient and silent, testing her resolve. Shaking off the chill, creeping along her spine, Eleanor reminded herself why she had come. This was more than a quest for historical truth. It was a confrontation with forces that had shaped history in secret. She had to remain calm, observant, and unyielding. She moved carefully from one pedestal to another, comparing the parchments with the manuscripts and the Knight's Journal. Every symbol, every seal, every annotation was a piece of a larger puzzle she was beginning to understand. Time seemed to stretch and warp within the chamber. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and Eleanor felt an almost tangible tension in the air. Yet, in the midst of fear, exhilaration surged. She was no longer merely a passive observer. She was engaging with the Brotherhood's preserved legacy, deciphering their designs, and testing her own capacity for insight and courage. Finally, she approached a wall that bore the most intricate carvings she had yet seen. It was a network of symbols, seals, and diagrams that seemed to combine the lessons of the manuscripts, the Knight's Journal, and the forest itself. Eleanor traced her fingers along the carvings, feeling a resonance, a connection across centuries. She understood that she was being marked as a participant, not an intruder or seeker meant to continue the work the Brotherhood had begun, but without succumbing to its manipulation. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the chamber, a presence that was not hostile but vigilant. Eleanor recognized it as another layer of testing, a challenge to her focus and perception. She breathed deeply and allowed herself to center in the knowledge she had gained. Fear had not paralyzed her. Curiosity and courage now guided her every movement. Eleanor opened the final parchment and read the lines carefully. It contained instructions not only for understanding the Brotherhood's operations, but for navigating the network of hidden truths across the roadmap for those willing to engage with history actively and responsibly. She realized that the path ahead would be dangerous, but also that she was no longer the same scholar who had arrived weeks ago. She had crossed thresholds, survived tests, and proven herself capable of engaging with forces that many would never even perceive. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Eleanor stood in the center of the chamber, manuscripts in hand, fully aware of the unseen eyes and the legacy she had stepped into. She was no longer merely a seeker of hidden truths. She was a participant, an active force in the unfolding story of the Brotherhood of the Veil. And as she whispered to the empty chamber, "I am ready," she understood that the challenges awaiting her would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage she possessed. But she was determined to continue, to uncover what history had tried to hide, and to navigate the shadows without fear. Eleanor Finch had entered the Brotherhood's domain fully, and there would be no turning back. Eleanor stepped out of the ruined building into the dimming light of the evening. The forest beyond the cliffs stretched silently, the mist now thinner but still curling in ghostly fingers across the ground. She could feel it immediately. The weight of observation, the subtle tug of awareness that something or someone was following her. The shadows seemed to shift when she looked away, settling into spaces she had already crossed, as though tracing her steps in perfect mimicry. She slowed, listening carefully. Every rustle of leaves, every faint crack of a twig seemed amplified. It was no longer the forest of the vanishing roads, nor the ruin filled with carved symbols. This was an open space, yet she felt trapped in the unseen grid of the Brotherhood's design. She realized for the first time that their influence was not confined to buildings or manuscripts. It extended across landscapes, through forests, and over terrain, marking and monitoring those who dared intrude. A soft movement in the shadows caught her eye. Eleanor froze, holding her breath. There, slightly obscured by the trees, a faint figure moved, almost It mirrored her pace, but remained distant, careful to maintain the ambiguity of its presence. The figure's form was human, but the way it flowed through the forest had an unnatural fluidity, a silent grace that suggested more than human endurance. Eleanor's heart pounded. The manuscripts, the knight's journal, and the hunter's warnings all returned to her mind. She understood that she was being tested not physically, not merely mentally, but in her ability to move, perceive, and act. Under pressure, every step, every glance, every choice mattered. The unseen observer was gauging her response, her attentiveness, her courage. She shifted slightly, changing her pace, pausing to examine a cluster of carved stones that marked the trail. The figure adjusted, maintaining the same measured distance, always present yet never approaching. Eleanor recognized the subtle choreography of the dance of awareness and discretion. She had learned to interpret in manuscripts and forest signs. This was a guardian, a living sentinel of the Brotherhood's hidden truths. Eleanor slowed her breathing and allowed her mind to focus entirely. She cataloged every sound, every movement, every shift in light and shadow. Slowly, she realized she could anticipate the figure's actions. Its movements were deliberate, controlled, responding to her own. She was learning the rhythm, the patterns, the logic hidden beneath the veneer of observation. As darkness deepened, the figure remained. Unseen, yet undeniable, a ghostly presence reminding her of the vigilance of the Brotherhood. Eleanor's pulse steady. Fear no longer dominated. Curiosity and determination now guided her. She had survived tests in the forest, interpreted the symbols in the ruins, and now she faced a living manifestation of scrutiny. And she understood that responding with calm intelligence was as critical as courage or endurance. The figure paused near a grove of ancient oaks. Eleanor stopped as well, maintaining eye contact with the shadows, acknowledging its presence without confronting it. A silent exchange passed between them, a communication without words, a recognition of understanding and capability. Eleanor felt a surge of confidence. She had proven she could remain composed, observe, and navigate, even when directly monitored. Night began to fall fully, and the forest darkened around her. The figure slowly receded into the shadows, leaving Eleanor alone once again. But the lesson remained. She was being watched, guided, and tested continuously. Every step ahead would require precision, patience, and unwavering awareness. Eleanor clenched the manuscripts close, feeling their weight not as a burden but as a source of guidance. She had been trained by history, literature, and shadows alike. She now understood that navigating the Brotherhood's legacy was as much about perception as knowledge, and that vigilance must accompany every move, every discovery. With a deep breath, she stepped forward along the dimly lit trail, her senses attuned to the faintest hint of movement, the subtlest changes in the air. She had crossed the threshold from passive seeker to active participant, ready to meet the Brotherhood's tests head-on. The shadows would follow, the whispers would murmur, and the unseen eyes would watch. But Eleanor Finch was no longer intimidated. She was learning to move within the unseen currents of history itself, and she was ready for whatever came next. The night deepened as Eleanor moved carefully along the winding trail, her senses sharpened by hours of observation and caution. The forest around her seemed alive, its shadows moving just beyond her vision, hinting at hidden presences. But it was not fear that guided her steps, no, it was purpose. She had survived tests, interpreted signs, and endured the silent scrutiny of unseen eyes. Her goal was clear. The key, a hidden artifact of the Brotherhood, meant to unlock a door that had remained closed for centuries. After what felt like hours, she came upon a small clearing dominated by an ancient stone pedestal, partially covered in moss and creeping vines. Atop it rested a weathered wooden chest, its metal bindings rusted with age. Eleanor knelt before it, noting intricate carvings on its surface. The symbols echoed those she had seen in the manuscripts, and in the ruins a silent language that spoke of caution, secrecy, and precision. She traced the carvings with her fingers, feeling the weight of history beneath her touch. Every mark, every indentation, seemed deliberate, a puzzle left by those who sought to protect their secrets. She carefully tested the chest, noting that it resisted force and responded only to precise alignment of the carved symbols. Her mind raced, comparing each detail to the patterns in the manuscripts. The chest was not just a container, it was a test, a gatekeeper, and a repository of hidden knowledge. Wheat patines Eleanor aligned the carvings according to the instructions she had deciphered from the Knight's journal and the Massachusetts manuscript. The chests shivered slightly beneath her hands, a subtle acknowledgement of her correct movements, and then, with a soft creak that echoed through the silent forest, the lid yielded. Inside lay a single object, a small, intricately forged key, its surface etched with symbols that matched those she had traced throughout her journey. It was delicate yet unmistakably powerful, an artifact that seemed to hum with centuries of hidden purpose. Eleanor picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand, and understood immediately. This was the key to a door the Brotherhood had sealed long ago, a physical and symbolic threshold that few had ever approached. The key's presence was more than a toolet, was a confirmation. Every step, every observation, every lesson from the manuscripts and the journals had led her to this moment. The Brotherhood's tests were as much about patience, perception, and careful reasoning as they were about courage, and Eleanor had proven capable on all counts. Yet even as she held the key, a shiver of unease ran through her. She could sense that this was only a beginning. The key did not reveal the door itself, nor the dangers that lay beyond. It was a signal, a bridge, and a challenge, and she understood that she would need every ounce of her resolve, every learned skill, and every insight from the manuscripts to proceed safely. Eleanor examined the key closely, noting the fine details, tiny etchings, the suggested movement patterns, hidden symbols designed to guide or warn, and the subtle craftsmanship of someone who understood the power of secrecy. She realized that this key was not merely a physical instrument. It was a cipher, a map, and a test all at once. As she stood in the clearing, holding the key tightly, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The path had been perilous, filled with shadows, whispers, and the constant sense of being watched. She had survived forests designed to confuse, ruins that tested intellect and courage, and the silent judgment of unseen observers. And now, with the key in her hand, she possessed not only a tool but a confirmation of her capability, a tangible acknowledgement of the journey she had undertaken and the trials she had endured. The night air pressed against her face, carrying with it the scent of moss, earth, and the faint, lingering traces of centuries-old secrets. Eleanor felt a surge of determination. She had the key, she had the manuscripts, and she had the knowledge to interpret the signs ahead. Whatever doors or challenges awaited her, she was prepared. With the key secured, she looked toward the deeper shadows of the forest, aware that her journey was far from over. Each step forward would demand patience, intelligence, and courage, but Eleanor Finch was no longer merely a seeker. She was a participant, a holder of secrets, and a navigator of history's hidden currents. And with the key in her hand, she felt ready to confront whatever lay behind the doors that had remained closed for centuries. She whispered to herself, "The next step begins." Eleanor moved cautiously through the shadowed forest, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The manuscripts had hinted at the existence of a hidden doorway, one sealed for centuries by the Brotherhood of the Veil. She had followed signs, deciphered symbols, and survived tests in the forest, the ruins, and the clearing. Now, she stood before a massive stone wall, partially overgrown with ivy, where the doorway was said to exist. The wall stretched higher than she could see, its surface scarred by time and weather. Embedded within it was an outline that seemed almost unnatural, a rectangular indentation suggesting a door, yet perfectly fused with the surrounding stone. Eleanor traced her fingers over the stone, feeling for seams, grooves, and the faint vibration that indicated the presence of a mechanism beneath the surface. The key in her hand seemed to hum, as if resonating with the hidden lock behind the stone. She paused, consulting her notes from the manuscripts. The Knight's journal had spoken of a door that was not merely physical. It demanded understanding, precision, and patience. The markings on the key, the symbols in the clearing, and the carvings in the ruins all converged here. Eleanor realized that every observation she had made, every pattern she had noted, every subtle shift in the environment was preparation for this moment. With deliberate care, she inserted the key into the faintly etched lock on the stone. It fit perfectly, as if designed for her alone. She turned it slowly, listening for clicks and subtle shifts. The stone did not budge immediately, but she felt the resonance deep within the wall. It was as though the building itself was testing her comprehension. assessing her awareness and patience. She pressed gently against the door, guided by the intricate patterns etched into the key. Faint lines of light began to trace the symbols on the surface of the stone, illuminating sequences that corresponded perfectly with the manuscript's instructions. Eleanor held her breath. This was not a matter of force. It was a matter of observation, understanding, and calm execution. She aligned each symbol in sequence, tracing the flow of the hidden design in her mind as if decoding a complex, living puzzle. Slowly, the stone trembled. The outline of the door became more pronounced, subtle lines shifting, interlocking, and unlocking in response to her careful movements. Eleanor felt a mixture of exhilaration and deep concentration. She understood now that the Brotherhood had designed this threshold not merely to protect knowledge, but to measure the readiness of those who sought it. Only someone attuned to history, patterns, and logic could proceed. A low rumble vibrated through the wall as the final symbol on the key aligned with its counterpart on the stone. A faint, almost imperceptible click resounded, and the doorway shifted. A narrow crack appeared, widening slowly until a faint shaft of light spilled from the hidden interior. Eleanor stepped back, heart racing. She had succeeded in reaching the threshold. Peering through the opening, she saw darkness within, a space filled with the scent of old wood, stone, and the faint trace of centuries-old secrets. It was impossible to see the full depth of the chamber from this angle, but she could sense the weight of history and knowledge contained inside. The air seemed charged, and Eleanor felt both anticipation and the weight of responsibility pressing upon her shoulders. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Every test she had endured, the forests, the ruins, the whispers, and the unseen observer had led to this moment. Eleanor understood that the next step would demand courage, intellect, and careful attention. The door was open, but entering meant confronting the unknown directly, facing whatever the Brotherhood had hidden behind it for centuries. With a final glance at the manuscripts, Eleanor stepped forward, key in hand, and crossed the threshold. The light from the opening faded behind her as she entered the chamber, the door sealing silently once more. She was inside, in a space untouched by time, a repository of knowledge, and a crucible for anyone seeking the hidden truths of the Brotherhood. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She was no longer merely following history. She was part of it. Every sound, every shadow, every symbol would test her once more, but she felt ready. She had prepared, learned, and endured. And now, within the hidden chamber, she would uncover what the Brotherhood had concealed for centuries. She whispered to herself, steady and determined. This is it. I am ready to see the truth. Eleanor stepped cautiously into the chamber, the door sealing quietly behind her. The air was thick with dust. It had carried a faint, almost metallic scent that suggested centuries of preserved secrets. The chamber was rectangular, high-ceilinged, and lined with shelves carved into the stone itself. Each shelf held scrolls, ancient books, and parchment bundles tied with decayed threads. Symbols, seals, and cryptic designs adorned the walls, etched with a precision that hinted at deliberate intention. She moved slowly, absorbing every detail. Her eyes were drawn to a series of circular carvings on the far wall, their patterns resembling those she had traced on the pedestal in the forest clearing. Eleanor realized the room itself was a map of sorts, an encoded representation of the Brotherhood's knowledge and operations. Every symbol, every seal, every placement had meaning, designed to guide, test, and perhaps intimidate anyone who entered. As she reached a central table, she noticed a series of shallow indentations carved into the surface. They formed a pattern that matched the etchings on her key. Placing the key carefully within one of the depressions, Eleanor felt a subtle vibration run through the table, a quiet hum that resonated through the floor and walls. The chamber seemed alive, responding to her presence, acknowledging her understanding, and testing her further. From the shadows, she sensed movements subtle, deliberate. Eleanor's heart raced. This was no ordinary chamber. She was not alone. Though she could see nothing directly, a presence seemed to trace her steps, watching, evaluating. The manuscripts had warned of such mechanisms. The Brotherhood employed guardians, both physical and metaphysical, to protect their most important knowledge. Every step she took, every motion she made, could trigger observation or test. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. Fear had once dominated her reactions. Now, focus guided them. She moved carefully among the shelves, scanning titles, symbols, and objects. Cross-referencing then with the manuscripts. Every discovery brought clarity, a sense of continuity with the centuries of planning she had been uncovering. The room was more than a storage space. It was a repository of strategy, intelligence, and hidden history. On one shelf, she found a bundle of parchment sealed with a wax emblem matching the symbol on her key. She opened it slowly, reading the meticulous notes of the Brotherhood. Strategies for influence, coded correspondency, and historical accounts adjusted to maintain secrecy. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she realized she was seeing the operational core of the Brotherhood for the first time. This room contained the proof, the logic, and the hidden mechanisms that had allowed them to survive and manipulate events across centuries. A subtle whispering seemed to echo through the chamber, flowing from the walls themselves. Eleanor paused, listening carefully. It was not language she could understand, but an unmistakable pattern of sound, a rhythm that seemed to emphasize particular symbols and passages. The manuscripts had hinted at auditory cues as part of the Brotherhood's layered defenses. She traced the rhythm with her hands over the carved designs, feeling the vibrations respond to her movements. The chamber, she realized, was not static. It required engagement, understanding, and intuition. As she explored further, Eleanor came to understand the deeper purpose of the chamber. It was not simply a storage of knowledge. It was a crucible, a testing ground. The Brotherhood had designed it to measure intelligence, perception, and patience. Anyone who succeeded here would gain access to the inner logic of the organization. Anyone who failed would leave without comprehension, their curiosity stifled, their observations incomplete. Eleanor's focus sharpened. Every symbol she touched, every pattern she traced, brought understanding. Slowly, connections formed in her mind, linking the forest, the ruins, the hidden doorway, and now this chamber. She saw the operational flow of the Brotherhood laid bare, their influence mapped across history, their secrets encoded in symbols, documents, and spaces designed to challenge perception. As she paused in the center of the room, holding the key above a map-like diagram etched into the floor, Eleanor realized something profound. She was no longer simply a seeker of hidden knowledge. She was an active participant in the continuation of the Brotherhood story. Every observation, every deduction, every cautious step was part of a dialogue with the past, and she could shape her path forward with intention and insight. The chamber remained silent, but Eleanor felt the watchful presence of the unseen guardians. She moved deliberately, fully aware that the room itself was evaluating her. Yet for the first time, the presence did not frighten her. It affirmed her readiness. She understood now that the challenges of the forest, the ruins, the key, and the door were all preparation for this moment. This room was the heart of the Brotherhood's hidden knowledge, and she was engaging with it fully. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor began to catalog the symbols, the manuscripts, and the parchments systematically. Her goal was clear: to understand the logic, the structure, and the concealed truths of the Brotherhood. With potence, focus, and careful observation, she would navigate the room's mysteries, decoding the strategies that had been preserved for centuries. She whispered softly to herself, steady and determined. I am ready to learn what has been hidden, and I will understand it. Eleanor moved carefully along the shelves, her fingers brushing over the faded spines of scrolls and leather-bound books. The chamber was silent, except for the faint sound of dust settling and the soft echo of her footsteps. Each bundle she examined contained meticulously preserved records, some written in languages she had studied, others in ciphers that required careful decoding. Every parchment, every script, was a testament to the Brotherhood's meticulous planning and their commitment to secrecy. She unrolled a scroll carefully, revealing a complex series of annotations, diagrams, and coded instructions. Eleanor recognized the patterns immediately. They were a record of influence, detailing how events had been guided, altered, or obscured over centuries. Kings, scholars, and institutions were referenced, not by name, but through symbols and coded phrases. The Brotherhood had orchestrated history in subtle ways, their influence hidden in plain sight. Eleanor felt a mixture of awe and unease. One particular scroll drew her attention. Unlike the others, it appeared to map a sequence of events that had historically seemed random, revealing the Brotherhood's careful manipulation behind each outcome. Eleanor traced the lines with her fingers, following the flow of cause and effect that had been concealed for generations. Battles, political shifts, even cultural transformations were recorded here as part of a larger design. The meticulous details suggested both intelligence and patience far beyond what she had imagined. As she absorbed the information, Eleanor understood a profound truth. She was no longer merely an observer. The Brotherhood had designed systems to influence the course of history, and the records in this chamber were the key to understanding that control. Knowledge alone was powerful, but comprehension, insight, and the ability to navigate it responsibly were even more crucial. She could see how small choices cascaded into major outcomes, how secrecy had protected the organization, and how discernment had preserved their power. Eleanor paused to examine another parchment, noting a series of symbols that represented communication networks across time. These were not simple messages, but encrypted instructions, linking individuals and groups over decades and centuries. The Brotherhood's operations were layered, interconnected, and almost impossible to trace without careful study. Eleanor realized that understanding this web of influence required not only intellect, but patience and humility. A soft breeze seemed to stir within the chamber, carrying with it the weight of centuries-old knowledge. Eleanor felt a subtle presence, not threatening, but watchful, as if the room itself acknowledged her diligence and insight. She carefully cataloged her observations, mentally connecting the sequences of events to the manuscripts she carried and the symbols she had traced throughout the journey. A coherent pattern began to emerge, one that illuminated the scale and precision of the Brotherhood's hidden work. Finally, Eleanor reached a small, delicate scroll tied with golden thread. Unlike the others, it contained annotated narratives, showing the hidden changes in history events that had been deliberately altered or guided to achieve specific outcomes. She read each passage with care, noting the meticulous planning, the subtlety, and the foresight involved. The Brotherhood had intervened in ways almost invisible to the world, shaping society and thought while remaining concealed. Eleanor realized the responsibility that came with such knowledge. She could not act impulsively. The wisdom she gained must be tempered with caution and moral judgment. The scrolls revealed not just the power to understand history, but the capacity to influence it, a capacity that demanded accountability, discipline, and restraint. She felt the weight of centuries pressing upon her consciousness, yet she also felt capable, prepared, and focused. As she carefully replaced the scrolls and documented her observations, Eleanor whispered to herself, "This is not just history. This is understanding, and I must carry it wisely." She knew that the chamber held secrets that could reshape perception, reveal hidden truths, and guide action, but only with intelligence and responsibility. Eleanor stepped back, taking a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room once more. She understood now that every trial, every challenge, and every observation had led her to this point. She was no longer simply following the breadcrumbs of the Brotherhood. She was engaging directly with their design, becoming part of the continuum they had carefully crafted over centuries. With steady resolve, Eleanor turned to face the center of the chamber, ready to continue deciphering the hidden truths. Fully aware of the responsibility that knowledge demanded, she was prepared for the next phase of her journey, a path that would test her intellect, courage, and ethical judgment in ways she had only begun to understand. Eleanor stepped through an archway at the far end of the chamber, drawn by the faint glimmer of reflected light. The air changed immediately, cooler, heavier, almost charged with anticipation. She entered a room unlike any she had encountered so far. Walls, floor, and ceiling were covered with polished surfaces that reflected not just light, but her presence. This was the mirror room, a space referenced only in fragments of manuscripts she had studied, and now it lay before her in full reality. At first, Eleanor saw only herself, tired, cautious, but determined. But as she moved deeper into the room, the reflections began to shift. She was no longer seeing only the present. Shadows of her past movements appeared, echoing her steps through the forest, the ruins, and the chamber itself. Every hesitation, every discovery, every precise alignment she had made was mirrored back at her, highlighting her diligence and alertness. Then the reflections began to change in ways she could not have anticipated. Figures from history, blurred and shadowed, passed across the mirrors. Scholars, knights, and others whose names had been coded in the manuscripts. They appeared engaged in subtle actions, manipulating symbols, influencing events, and leaving traces that Eleanor had begun to uncover. The room presented history as an interactive reflection, a complex overlay of choices, consequences, and design. Eleanor realized the room was not simply a mirror but a test. It was designed to measure her comprehension, perception, and ability to interpret multiple layers of reality at once. Each reflection carried subtle cues, gestures, symbols, and sequences that guided her understanding of the Brotherhood's methods. She moved slowly, observing, interpreting, and mentally cataloging each detail. Missteps here could distort her perception, leading her to misunderstand the hidden truths. As she stepped further in, the reflections began to depict potential futures. Eleanor saw scenarios of success, where her understanding of the manuscripts and chamber led her to uncover even deeper secrets, and scenarios of failure, where haste or misinterpretation left her trapped in confusion. The mirror room challenged not just intellect but patience, foresight, and self. Every choice she made had immediate consequences within the reflections, teaching her that the path of knowledge was inseparable from responsibility. A faint, almost imperceptible voice seemed to echo in the room, guiding her attention to particular patterns in the mirrors. Eleanor followed the subtle hints, tracing the symbols and movements with her fingers and mind alike. The chamber responded, the reflections shifting to reward clarity, focus, and precision. It became evident that the Brotherhood had constructed this room to test not only comprehension but character. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Discernment, patience, and ethical judgment were essential. Eleanor paused at the center of the room, examining a series of mirrors that formed a circle around her. Here, her own movements were mirrored in multiplicity, multiplied across dimensions of time, choice, and consequence. She understood now that this room was a microcosm of the Brotherhood itself. Layered, complex, and observing. Success required integration, connecting past, present, and potential futures into a coherent understanding. As she absorbed the lessons of the mirror room, Eleanor felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer merely a seeker of hidden truths. She was a participant in the continuum of history and influence. The reflections reinforced what she had learned in the forest, the ruins, the chamber, and the Key's journey. Every action, observation, and decision mattered. Understanding came not only from knowledge but from engagement, perception, and moral clarity. Finally, Eleanor stepped back from the mirrored circle, her pulse steady, her mind focused. She had passed the test of reflection, demonstrating awareness, patience, and insight. The room's whispers faded into silence, leaving only the faint glow of reflected light. She knew that deeper challenges awaited, but she now possessed the inner clarity and confidence to face them. Eleanor whispered to herself, resolute and calm, "I see the path. I understand the rules. I am ready for what comes next." With that, she moved toward the far exit of the mirror room, prepared to continue her journey into the deeper mysteries of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor exited the mirror room, her mind still vibrating with the lessons of reflection. Ahead, she saw a narrow corridor leading to a slender bridge suspended over what appeared to be a chasm. The faint glimmer of light from below suggested depth beyond comprehension, and the air was thick with the scent of stone and dust. The bridge itself was ancient, the wood worn and uneven, the ropes frayed with age. It was clear that every step forward would require balance, precision, and unwavering attention. She stepped cautiously onto the first plank. The bridge creaked under her weight, responding to every shift, testing her awareness and composure. Shadows danced across the walls from the faint glow beneath, forming shapes that seemed to mock or guide her, blurring the line between reality and illusion. Eleanor reminded herself to breathe, to focus on each movement, and to trust her instincts as well as her acquired knowledge. As she moved forward, she realized the bridge was more than a physical obstacle. Its layout mirrored patterns she had studied in the manuscripts, and observed in the ruins the placement of planks and ropes echoed the sequences of symbols she had traced on the key and in the chambers. The Brotherhood had designed the bridge not merely to test courage, but to measure perception, patience, and alignment with their hidden logic. Halfway across, the bridge shifted subtly, a warning from the centuries-old structure. Eleanor paused, recalibrating her steps and scanning the shadows. She noticed faint markings carved into the wood, tiny symbols that corresponded to warnings and instructions in the manuscripts. Each careful observation allowed her to adjust her balance and advance with renewed confidence. This was no ordinary crossing. It was an exercise in precision, awareness, and resilience. A sudden movement in the shadows caught her eye, a subtle shift that mimicked her every motion. Eleanor froze, realizing that the unseen guardian of the bridge was observing, evaluating, testing her mental steadiness as much as her physical balance. The mirror-like reflections of light and shadow played tricks on perception, forcing her to distinguish between illusion and reality. She felt a surge of exhilaration and focused. This was the ultimate test of everything she had learned so far. Step by step, plank by plank, Eleanor progressed. Her mind cataloged every symbol, every shift of shadow, every subtle vibration in the wood. She aligned her movements with the hidden logic of the bridge, tracing its patterns and anticipating its response. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, but Eleanor's resolve did not waver. She understood that success depended not on haste or brute force, but on careful observation, disciplined thought, and steady action. Finally, she reached the far side. The bridge ended abruptly at a stone platform, leading into darkness beyond. Eleanor exhaled, her muscles tense but triumphant. She had crossed the shadow bridge, a symbolic and literal threshold in the Brotherhood's labyrinth. Every test, the forest, the ruins, the mirror room. And now this bridge had trained her for this moment, sharpening her awareness, patience, and courage. She looked back once, observing the span she had traversed, the shadows that still clung to the ropes and planks, the subtle signs of unseen presence. Eleanor understood that the Brotherhood had constructed this bridge not just to protect their knowledge, but to measure the readiness of those who sought it. She had passed. With the key still secure and her manuscripts in hand, Eleanor stepped forward into the darkness beyond the bridge. The unknown awaited, a deeper level of secrets and challenges that would test her intellect, perception, and resolve. Yet she was no longer hesitant. She had learned to read symbols, interpret shadows, and move with intention. She had become a participant in a game centuries in the making. She whispered to herself, steady and resolute. The path continues, and I am ready. Eleanor's footsteps echoed into the darkness, each one carrying her deeper into the hidden heart of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor stepped onto the stone platform at the end of the shadow bridge, her heart still racing from the crossing. Ahead, a new chamber revealed itself, larger than any she had entered before. The walls were smooth, polished stone, reflecting the faint light that streamed from cracks in the ceiling. In the center stood a formidable door, tall and imposing, its surface etched with complex symbols and geometric patterns. Unlike the previous door, this one did not respond to her key. It demanded more than a physical solution. She approached cautiously, examining the intricate carvings. Each symbol seemed purposeful, interconnected, forming sequences that resonated with the manuscripts he had studied. The Brotherhood's design was evident. This was not a barrier of force, but of intellect and understanding. Eleanor realized she would need to decode the logic embedded in the door's etchings to proceed. Every curve, every intersection, every alignment of symbols carried meaning, a challenge to her perception and reasoning. Kneeling before the door, she traced the patterns with her fingers. Some symbols mirrored those she had encountered in the mirror room, while others seemed entirely new, abstract, and Eleanor considered the ethical implications hinted at. And the manuscripts, these puzzles, were not merely intellectual, but demanded moral discernment. The Brotherhood had designed their hidden chambers to test judgment as much as intelligence. She took a deep breath, studying the sequences. Symbols of balance, cycles, and hidden symmetry guided her focus. Eleanor compared them with the notes in her manuscripts, aligning her observations with historical patterns, hidden codes, and sequences she had uncovered in the ruins. Slowly, she began to see connections. The door's carvings formed a narrative of cause and consequence, each symbol representing a choice, a test, or a principle. A subtle hum vibrated through the stone as she traced the sequences. Eleanor felt a presence like the unseen guardians she had sensed before, but this time it was less threatening and more evaluative. The chamber itself seemed aware of her process, responding to her reasoning. She realized that patience and precision were as critical here as in the mirror room or on the shadow bridge. Any misstep, any rushed decision, could trigger an error or seal the path forward. Hours passed as Eleanor worked methodically, aligning symbols and deciphering patterns. The door seemed to respond incrementally, subtle shifts visible in the etched lines, as if acknowledging her progress. The complexity was staggering, yet she remained composed, cataloging every detail, cross-referencing with the manuscripts and her observations from earlier trials. It was a dance of intellect, patience, and moral intuition, each guiding her closer to understanding. Finally, she noticed a pattern emerging. The sequence required simultaneous attention to symmetry, timing, and ethical alignment suggested in the manuscripts. Eleanor synchronized her movements, tracing the symbols with care, pausing to ensure accuracy, then continuing. The door vibrated softly, resonating with the correct alignment, a signal that she had understood its hidden logic. A low, echoing click resounded through the chamber. The symbols glowed faintly, illuminating the room with a warm, diffused light. Eleanor stepped back, heart pounding, as the door slowly began to open. Beyond it lay darkness, deep and inviting, a space untouched and unknown. She understood that she had passed another test, combining intellect, patience, and discernment. Eleanor's eyes glimmered with determination. Each challenge had strengthened her resolve and sharpened her perception. The new chamber promised deeper secrets, hidden knowledge, and the continuation of her journey through the Brotherhood's carefully guarded legacy. She took a deep breath, stepping forward toward the opening, prepared to face the mysteries within. She whispered softly to herself, "Every step is a lesson, every challenge a key." "I am ready for what lies beyond." Eleanor crossed the threshold, entering the dark chamber beyond the enigmatic door, her senses heightened and her mind fully alert to the secrets that awaited. Eleanor stepped cautiously into the chamber beyond the enigmatic door. Darkness enveloped her completely, swallowing the faint light from the corridor behind. The air was heavy and still, carrying a subtle vibration that she could feel against her skin. Every step she took echoed softly, yet it seemed absorbed into the black void around her. This was no ordinary room. It was an environment designed to unsettle, to test perception, patience, and inner focus. Her hand moved instinctively to the key at her side, though she realized it would offer no help here. The symbols she had deciphered and the manuscripts she carried provided guidance, but the room demanded engagement of a different kind: intuition, sensitivity, and mental acuity. She sensed a presence, something unseen but undeniably there, moving with deliberate caution, evaluating her every motion. Eleanor inhaled deeply, centering herself. She knew that fear would compromise her ability to perceive subtle cues. Each step had to be deliberate, measured, and guided by awareness. She paused, listening to the faint resonances that pulsed through the stone beneath her feet, vibrations that hinted at hidden mechanisms, pathways, and invisible obstacles. The chamber was alive, reacting to her, testing her readiness for deeper revelations. As she advanced slowly, shapes began to materialize in the darkness. They were ephemeral, shifting forms that seemed to echo fragments of her own experience east the ruins. The mirror room, the shadow bridge. Each shadow carried lessons, patterns, and warnings. Eleanor realized that the Brotherhood had constructed this space to reinforce her accumulated knowledge, forcing her to apply it actively in a challenging and disorienting environment. A faint whisper drifted through the darkness, rhythmic and deliberate. Eleanor concentrated, interpreting the pattern. It matched sequences she had studied in the manuscripts, a coded instruction, a guide to the room's hidden order. Following the auditory cues, she navigated the space with cautious precision, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. Every hesitation, every misstep could obscure the path forward. Every observation strengthened her connection to the hidden logic. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely. The darkness pressed against her mind, amplifying self-doubt and uncertainty. Yet Eleanor remained focused. She understood that this trial was about more than intellect. It was about resilience, perception, and the courage to navigate uncertainty. She felt the weight of the Brotherhood's design, an intricate system meant to separate those capable of insight from those unprepared for the depths of their secrets. Finally, she felt a subtle change in the chamber. The vibrations shifted, the whispers adjusted, and a faint, cool light began to glow ahead. Eleanor moved toward it carefully, interpreting the signals she had learned to trust. The light revealed the faint outline of another door, simpler than the last, but no less significant. It marked a transition, a threshold deeper into the Brotherhood's inner sanctum. Eleanor paused before the door, taking stock of her journey. Every test the forests, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, and this chamber of darkness had sharpened her intellect, focus, and courage. She realized that her understanding of the Brotherhood's design had she was no longer merely following instructions, but interpreting, anticipating, and responding to the hidden logic herself. With a deep breath, Eleanor placed her hand on the door handle, feeling its subtle energy, the resonance of centuries-old secrecy. She knew that whatever lay beyond would demand even greater discernment, courage, and perception. Yet she was ready. She had passed every trial so far, and this was simply another step toward uncovering the hidden heart of the Brotherhood. She whispered softly to herself, "I have learned. I have observed. Now, I will move forward." Eleanor turned the handle and stepped into the chamber beyond, prepared to face whatever secrets awaited her in the deepest layers of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor stepped cautiously into the chamber beyond the dark threshold. This room felt different immediately. The air was charged with an almost tangible energy, and the faint glow emanating from intricate symbols illuminated shelves, pedestals, and artifacts, arranged with meticulous care. The space was vast, its ceilings high and walls covered in carved motifs that pulsed faintly as if alive. She realized instinctively this was the inner sanctum of the Brotherhood, the repository of their most guarded secrets. Every surface seemed to radiate history and purpose. Tables held carefully aligned scrolls, books, and strange devices whose function was not immediately apparent. Symbols etched in the walls were mirrored in some of the artifacts, forming a network of meaning Eleanor had begun to recognize from her study of manuscripts. This chamber was a living puzzle, designed to test intellect, observation, and moral discernment simultaneously. Eleanor approached a central pedestal where an open book lay, its pages filled with precise diagrams and notes in a cipher she could partially decode. She traced the markings carefully, her fingers moving with reverence. The book seemed to describe the Brotherhood's long-term strategies, methods of influence, cryptic communication networks, and ethical guidelines for maintaining secrecy. Each page confirmed what she had begun to suspect: this organization had operated with purpose and calculation for centuries, its actions hidden yet profoundly impactful. As she explored further, Eleanor discovered devices that seemed almost mechanical yet integrated with symbolic meaning. She realized they represented ways the Brotherhood maintained surveillance, communication, and the transmission of knowledge. Each object was a lesson, requiring her to apply the patterns she had learned in previous trials. The room was both classroom and crucible, a place where insight was tested against centuries of intentional design. Eleanor moved carefully between shelves, cataloging observations, taking mental notes, and cross-referencing with the manuscripts and key she carried. She felt the presence of unseen guardians, again not threatening, but evaluative, ensuring that she approached each artifact and symbol with understanding and respect. She understood now that knowledge alone was not sufficient. Interpretation, discretion, and judgment were essential. A subtle hum resonated through the room, vibrating through the floor and into her body. Eleanor followed the sensation to a series of interconnected symbols etched into a circular pattern on the floor. Placing the key in the center, she felt the hum intensify, revealing hidden lines of energy that connected various points in the chamber. The network mapped out not only physical locations, but conceptual links, showing the interrelation of the Brotherhood's strategies, records, and methods. Eleanor's pulse quickened, She was witnessing the operational core of an organization that had influenced history from the shadows. Hours passed as she studied, decoded, and documented. She began to understand the layered approach the Brotherhood had used: secrecy, guidance, and careful selection of those deemed worthy. Each trial she had faced the forests, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, and the Chamber of Darkness had prepared her to engage with this knowledge responsibly. She felt both humbled and empowered. Finally, Eleanor stepped back, taking in the room as a whole. She realized she was no longer merely a seeker. She had become an active participant, capable of interpreting and navigating the intricate logic of the Brotherhood. She gathered key scrolls and artifacts, committing their patterns and sequences to memory. The next phase of her journey would require this knowledge, applied with insight, patience, and discernment. Eleanor whispered softly to herself, her voice steady. I have seen the heart of the Brotherhood. I understand their design. Now, I must use this knowledge wisely. With renewed determination, she prepared to leave the inner sanctum, aware that the deeper mysteries and tests still awaited, but confident in her ability to face them. Eleanor carefully explored the inner sanctum, her eyes drawn to shelves filled with meticulously organized scrolls and bound volumes. These documents were unlike any she had seen before. Their content was precise, layered, and encoded, representing centuries of deliberate planning. Each scroll carried information critical to understanding not only the Brotherhood's operations but also the hidden currents of history they had influenced. Eleanor felt a mix of awe and responsibility as she approached them. She opened one scroll and began to trace the elegant script. The markings revealed interventions in historical events, subtle manipulations designed to preserve stability, and strategies for guiding knowledge without exposing the organization. It was clear that the Brotherhood had never sought power for its own sake. Their purpose was preservation, guidance, and careful oversight. Eleanor realized that this chamber was the archive of centuries-long vigilance, a place where history itself had been cataloged and protected. Other documents detailed correspondence between members, strategies for maintaining secrecy, and the subtle ways the Brotherhood had influenced major decisions across generations. Eleanor could see patterns emerging. How small, precise actions cascaded into large-scale effects, how secrecy ensured the continuity of their objectives, and how each member was trained to observe, deduce, and act responsibly. This was not merely historical. Recorded was a blueprint for understanding influence, control, and ethical responsibility. As she studied further, Eleanor found references to key events she had researched in the manuscripts: the rise and fall of leaders, pivotal battles, and cultural transformations. The scrolls provided clarity, revealing which actions had been guided and which had been left to chance. The Brotherhood's interventions were subtle, yet profound, shaping outcomes without ever revealing their hand. Eleanor felt a profound respect for the organization's discipline and foresight, and a growing awareness of the responsibility that came with her knowledge. Among the documents, she discovered a small, intricately detailed map marking locations where important records were hidden. Some were within historical ruins she had already explored. Others were yet to be discovered. Eleanor understood that her journey was not yet complete. She had gained insight into the Brotherhood's methods and principles, but she would need to continue to follow these threads, carefully and deliberately, to fully uncover the organization's deeper secrets. As she cataloged her findings, Eleanor reflected on the lessons of the chamber. Knowledge alone was not enough. It required discernment, patience, and moral clarity. The Brotherhood had tested her through every previous trial to ensure she was capable of handling this insight responsibly. She could see now that the hidden power lay not in secrecy itself, but in the ability to understand, interpret, and act wisely. Eleanor carefully gathered the most significant scrolls and artifacts, securing them within her satchel. She stepped back, surveying the room one last time. The chamber had revealed the core philosophy of the Brotherhood, a commitment to careful preservation of knowledge, meticulous observation, and ethical guidance. It was a repository of influence, wisdom, and responsibility. With a deep breath, she whispered to herself, I understand the structure. I see the intentions. Now, I must continue with care and insight. Eleanor prepared to move deeper into the hidden corridors, confident that the knowledge she had gained would guide her through the remaining challenges of the Brotherhood of the Veil. After carefully securing the scrolls and artifacts, Eleanor turned her attention to the far wall of the inner sanctum. Faint, almost imperceptible markings ran along the edges of the stone, forming a subtle pattern she had not noticed before. She approached cautiously, tracing the lines with her fingers. The markings pulsed slightly under her touch, revealing themselves as a hidden pathway, a secret corridor leading deeper into the Brotherhood's most protected areas. Eleanor studied the signs carefully. The path was obscured, blending seamlessly with the walls and floor, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. The manuscripts had hinted at such hidden passages, describing the invisible threads that connected chambers of knowledge and control. Now she understood that the Brotherhood had created these corridors as both protection and guidance, leading only those capable of understanding to the next level of their secrets. With deliberate care, Eleanor followed the symbols etched into the floor. Each step was a test. A misalignment of foot placement or misinterpretation of a signal could trigger a concealed mechanism or lock the passage temporarily. The corridor was narrow, dark, and silent, but the markings guided her, offering reassurance that she was on the correct path. She moved slowly, alert to every subtle vibration, shadow, and line that indicated the next step forward. As she progressed, Eleanor sensed a profound shift in the atmosphere. The air grew cooler, and the faint hum of energy she had felt in the inner sanctum became more pronounced. She realized that she was entering a section of the Brotherhood's domain that was both symbolically and physically significant, a core of their hidden influence and planning. The corridor itself was a test of focus, perception, and understanding, designed to ensure that only those prepared could reach the heart of their secrets. Shadows flickered along the walls as her footsteps echoed softly. Eleanor paused at one particular sequence of symbols, recalling patterns she had observed in the mirror room and on the shadow bridge. She aligned her movements with the coded instructions, following the invisible logic woven into the corridor's design. The pathway responded subtly, guiding her further while testing her precision and awareness. Every decision mattered, and Eleanor knew that careful observation was essential. After what felt like hours of navigating the narrow, secretive corridor, Eleanor reached a subtle widening in the passage. Ahead, the markings indicated an intersection, another threshold leading to a chamber that promised even deeper revelations. She paused to take stock, reflecting on the knowledge she had gained and the challenges she had overcome. Each trialda, forest, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, darkness, and inner sanctum had prepared her for this very moment. Her intellect, patience, and discernment were now fully engaged. Eleanor took a deep breath, centering herself. She recognized that the path she followed was not merely physical but symbolic, a journey through the principles, challenges, and wisdom of the Brotherhood. Her steps were deliberate, her mind alert, and her awareness heightened. This invisible corridor was more than a connection between chambers. It was a demonstration of the Brotherhood's philosophy, testing her readiness for the secrets that lay ahead. Finally, she reached the end of the corridor. A faint glow ahead marked the entrance to a chamber whose significance was immediately apparent. Even in the dim light, Eleanor's heart raced with anticipation. She had successfully navigated the invisible path, demonstrating her focus, insight, and understanding. The next chamber would challenge her in new ways, but she was ready, prepared by every step of her journey thus far. With steady resolve, Eleanor stepped forward toward the glowing threshold, her senses alert and her mind prepared for the deeper mysteries of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor emerged from the invisible corridor into a chamber bathed in a soft, mysterious light. Unlike the darkness she had navigated before, this room seemed alive, illuminated by subtle glows emanating from the walls and objects within. The light was warm yet unearthly, revealing symbols etched into the floors and shelves, glowing faintly as if responding to her presence. Eleanor felt immediately that this illumination was not merely functional, it was part of the Brotherhood's design, guiding and testing her simultaneously. The chamber contained shelves lined with scrolls, small artifacts, and geometric instruments of unknown purpose. Every item seemed deliberately placed, positioned to engage her observation and interpretation. Eleanor approached cautiously, aware that the light itself might be a test. Its subtle shifts could reveal hidden symbols or distort perceptions, challenging her focus and discernment. This room demanded more than intellect. It required intuition, patience, and careful attention. She reached for a scroll, its edges glowing softly. The symbols and diagrams seemed to dance in the light, revealing layers of meaning only visible when observed carefully. Eleanor realized that the illumination was interactive, highlighting connections between texts, artifacts, and carvings that would otherwise remain obscure. The Brotherhood had designed this chamber not only to store knowledge, but to engage the mind fully, blending observation, interpretation, and insight. As she explored, Eleanor noticed faint reflections along the polished floor and walls. Each reflection carried information, movements, alignments, or patterns that hinted at sequences she had studied in previous chambers. She traced the shapes, cross-referencing with her manuscripts, the key, and prior observations. The room was teaching her a new language, one of light, shadow, and pattern, revealing secrets embedded in perception itself. Hours passed as she cataloged the artifacts and scrolls, carefully noting how the glow emphasized specific symbols or sequences. Eleanor began to see connections, hidden instructions, ethical guidelines, and operational strategies of the Brotherhood illuminated only under precise observation. The room's design reinforced her understanding that knowledge required patience, clarity, and thoughtful engagement, not merely cursory reading. A soft vibration ran through the floor beneath her feet. Eleanor felt the chamber respond to her presence, confirming that she was correctly interpreting the sequences. The light seemed to pulse subtly, highlighting a series of nested diagrams on a pedestal in the center of the room. Approaching carefully, she traced the symbols, feeling the resonance of centuries-old design. Each motion, each observation, drew her closer to understanding the deeper logic of the Brotherhood. Finally, Eleanor paused, taking in the entire chamber. She realized that the light was both literal and metaphorical, revealing the paths of thought, insight, and moral discernment necessary to navigate the Brotherhood's secrets. She had gained new information, confirmed patterns, and strengthened her perception and judgment. The lessons of the previous chambers, the forest, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, darkness, inner sanctum, an invisible corridor culminated here, preparing her for what lay beyond. With steady resolve, Eleanor whispered softly to herself, "Every light reveals a truth, and every truth demands understanding. I am ready." She gathered the most significant artifacts and scrolls, preparing to move toward the next threshold, fully alert and confident in her ability to continue deeper into the hidden heart of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the soft, mysterious light of the chamber as she moved closer to the walls lined with intricate symbols. Each carving, each mark, seemed alive with meaning, their forms more complex than anything she had previously encountered. She realized that these ancient signs were more than decorative. They were a language, a code developed over centuries to convey information, guidance, and even moral instruction. She traced her fingers along a sequence of symbols, recognizing patterns she had seen in manuscripts and scrolls earlier in her journey. Each combination carried layered meaning, connecting ethical choices to strategic actions. Eleanor understood that interpreting them required more than logic. It demanded intuition, observation, and the ability to discern subtle. She began decoding carefully, aligning each symbol with her accumulated knowledge and experiences from the mirror room, shadow bridge, and inner sanctum. Some symbols glowed faintly as she approached, revealing hidden annotations and connections. Eleanor realized that the light itself acted as a guide, responding to her understanding and attention. The chamber seemed almost sentient, rewarding accurate interpretation while withholding clues from missteps. She followed the sequences step by step, noting how particular symbols indicated pathways, actions, or decisions. Hours passed as she painstakingly worked through the layers of meaning. The patterns told stories of the Brotherhood's history, their strategic interventions, and the ethical principles that governed their actions. Eleanor saw the ways in which they had influenced events, preserved knowledge, and guided outcomes without exposing their presence. The symbols also hinted at challenges she had yet to face, tests that would require even greater focus, patience, and judgment. At the center of the chamber, a cluster of symbols formed a map-like arrangement, pointing toward locations and sequences she had not yet explored. Eleanor recognized that this was the next phase of her journey. A path defined not just by physical movement but by understanding, strategy, and insight. She realized that following these directions accurately would bring her deeper into the Brotherhood's hidden core. Eleanor paused, absorbing the significance of the discovery. The symbols were not merely instructions, they were a reflection of the Brotherhood's philosophy. Knowledge, patience, discernment, and moral clarity intertwined. She understood that any misinterpretation could lead her astray, but careful, thoughtful engagement would reveal the path forward. With a steady breath, Eleanor whispered to herself, "These signs are a guide, a test, and a lesson. I will follow them wisely." She began preparing for the next step, following the guidance embedded in the ancient symbols, ready to navigate deeper into the secrets of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Following the guidance of the ancient symbols, Eleanor entered a chamber unlike any she had experienced before. The air shimmered faintly, carrying a sense of temporal weight. She realized immediately that this room was known among the manuscripts as the boundary of time. Here, the past and potential futures were visible in fleeting reflections and subtle shifts in light. Each movement she made seemed to ripple through the room, echoing events that had happened centuries ago and possibilities yet to unfold. At first, Eleanor saw faint glimpses of her own path of forests. The ruins, the mirror room, the shadow bridge, and the inner sanctum. Each moment replayed with subtle variations, revealing choices she had made and the paths those choices had shaped. The chamber seemed to emphasize the interconnectedness of action and consequence, showing how the smallest decision could reverberate through history. Gradually, the reflections shifted to scenarios she had not yet experienced. Eleanor saw events influenced by the Brotherhood that had not yet occurred, outcomes contingent on knowledge, discretion, and foresight. She understood that the organization did more than preserve history. They studied potential futures, observing probabilities and guiding events with precision. It was both awe-inspiring and daunting. As she moved deeper into the chamber, the light focused on a set of objects in the center. Scrolls, instruments, and a delicate globe that seemed to rotate on its own axis, highlighting nodes of historical significance. Eleanor approached cautiously, studying each item. The reflections she had seen aligned with the artifacts, showing her not only what had been done but what could be done with careful judgment. Hours passed as she examined the instruments and texts. Eleanor realized that understanding temporal patterns required synthesis of all she had learned: the manuscripts, the mirror room, the shadow bridge, the darkness, and the inner sanctum. She began to perceive the subtle principles behind the Brotherhood's decisions: patience, ethical consideration, and strategic foresight. Each reflection, artifact, was a lesson in responsibility and insight. Finally, Eleanor paused at the center of the chamber. Taking stock of the revelations, she felt a deep sense of preparedness and purpose. The boundary of time had shown her that knowledge carried responsibility, that observation and discernment were essential, and that every decision, however small, could shape outcomes in profound ways. With a steady breath, she whispered to herself, "I see the past. I sense the future. I will act with clarity and wisdom." Eleanor turned toward the next passage, confident in her understanding, fully prepared to face the challenges and mysteries awaiting her in the hidden depths of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor stepped into a narrow passage beyond the boundary of time, immediately sensing the profound silence enveloping her. The air was thick and still, carrying no echoes, no sound, only a faint vibration that she could feel in her bones. This was the silent corridor, a space designed to test patience, awareness, and precise movement. Every step she took demanded complete focus, for a misstep could lead to disorientation or trigger hidden mechanisms. Her eyes adjusted to the dim glow from faint markings along the walls, barely visible, yet clearly intentional. The markings served as subtle guides, directing her path while testing her perception. Eleanor moved slowly, her senses attuned to every vibration, shadow, and line of light. In this corridor, the absence of noise heightened her awareness, revealing details she might otherwise have overlooked. The silent corridor was more than a physical challenge. It was a lesson in composure. Eleanor realized that the Brotherhood used silence to sharpen observation, refine intuition, and emphasize the importance of careful action. Here, Impatience could be dangerous, and hesitation could mislead. She reminded herself of every trial she had endured: the forests, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, darkness, inner sanctum, invisible corridor, and boundary of time. Each had prepared her for this challenge, and now her training was put to the ultimate test. As she proceeded, subtle changes in the faint markings indicated the correct path. Eleanor followed them with precision, noting small patterns, subtle shifts, and almost imperceptible symbols etched into the stone. These cues required her full attention and understanding of the principles she had learned throughout her journey. Each correct step reinforced her confidence. Each misreading tested her focus and composure. Hours passed in careful progression. Eleanor's movements were deliberate and mindful. She felt as though the corridor itself was observing her, silently confirming her awareness and judgment. Occasionally, a faint light would shimmer along the walls, highlighting a particular symbol or sequence, rewarding her patience and perceptive observation. It was a delicate balance of trust, intuition, and meticulous action. Finally, Eleanor reached the end of the silent corridor. A faint glow ahead revealed a doorway, slightly ajar, leading into a chamber that promised further revelations. She exhaled, feeling a quiet triumph. The silent corridor had tested her in ways she had not anticipated, strengthening her focus, patience, and precision. She understood that the lessons of silence were as critical as any lesson of light, shadow, or reflection. With steady resolve, Eleanor stepped forward toward the glowing doorway, ready to confront the next level of the Brotherhood's hidden world. Fully attuned to the lessons she had learned in silence, Eleanor stepped through the doorway at the end of the silent corridor and immediately felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The chamber ahead was vast, its walls and floor polished to a reflective sheen. She realized instantly that this was the chamber of echoes, a place where every sound, movement, and heartbeat would resonate and multiply, testing both precision and composure. The moment she took a step, faint reverberations echoed across the room, amplifying her presence and forcing her to move deliberately. Eleanor understood that this chamber was designed to test more than physical skill. It was a trial of mental focus, self-control, and ethical steadiness. Each movement she made could influence the reflections, creating subtle shifts that would challenge her understanding of cause and consequence. She moved slowly, noting how even the quietest breaths sent ripples across the polished floor. Shadows danced on the walls in response to her steps, forming transient shapes that echoed previous chambers: the forests, ruins, mirror room, shadow bridge, darkness, inner sanctum, invisible, corridor, boundary of time, and silent corridor. Each reflection was a reminder that her journey had prepared her for this moment. Combining all the lessons she had learned into a single test, Eleanor paused in the center of the chamber, listening to the echoes of her own heartbeat. She realized that the room not only mirrored her physical actions, but also amplified her emotional and moral responses. Hesitation, doubt, or impatience would reverberate, potentially creating distortions that could mislead her. She focused her mind, steadying her breathing, and aligning her movements with her inner sense of calm and purpose. As she advanced, the echoes formed patterns, subtle sequences that indicated the next step or highlighted hidden cues within the chamber. Eleanor traced these signals with her eyes and feet, understanding that precision and mindfulness were essential. The reflections seemed to respond to her awareness, rewarding careful observation and disciplined action. She felt a profound connection between movement, intention, and consequence, a lesson the Brotherhood had embedded deliberately. Hours passed as Eleanor navigated the Chamber of Echoes. Each careful step reinforced her confidence and sharpened her perception. She began to understand that this chamber was not merely a physical trial, but a preparation for the ultimate tests ahead. The echoes reflected her growth, intellect, patience, courage, and moral clarity. Finally, she reached the far end of the chamber. The echoes settled into stillness, leaving her alone in a faintly glowing threshold that marked the next stage of her journey. Eleanor exhaled, feeling a surge of accomplishment and readiness. She had mastered the interplay of sound, reflection, and intention, strengthening her resolve for the remaining mysteries of the Brotherhood of the Veil. With steady determination, she stepped toward the next threshold, confident in her ability to face the hidden trials that awaited beyond. Eleanor stepped into the next chamber and immediately felt a warmth unlike any she had experienced in the dim corridors or silent spaces. The room was softly lit by ancient, flickering lamps, each casting gentle pools of light across the walls and floor. She realized that this was the chamber of memory, a space designed to illuminate the past, reflecting events long gone, triumphs achieved, and mistakes made. The walls were covered with etched images that seemed to shift as she moved, revealing stories in sequence, as if the room itself remembered the history of the Brotherhood. Eleanor saw figures studying, debating, and guiding events in secrecy. The flickering light highlighted their expressions, gestures, and tools, allowing her to witness the deliberate care and moral deliberation involved in each action. She approached one of the central lamps and noticed that it projected a small scene on the wall, a key decision made centuries ago that had influenced the course of history. Eleanor watched attentively, realizing that the Brotherhood did not merely record events, they studied them, learned from them, and ensured that lessons were carried forward. Every success and failure was preserved, analyzed, and used as guidance for future members. Eleanor moved carefully through the chamber, observing scenes that unfolded with the flicker of each lamp. Battles, negotiations, and subtle interventions in societies long past were displayed before her eyes. She understood that the Brotherhood's power lay not only in secrecy, but in the meticulous study of human behavior, ethics, and cause and effect. This chamber was a testament to their dedication to knowledge, responsibility, and foresight. As she traced her fingers along the etched walls, Eleanor noticed small annotations, symbols, and notes connecting events to broader strategies. Each lesson in the past was linked to principles of action, patience, and moral judgment. Eleanor realized that the room was a living archive, teaching her not only history, but how to interpret it, how to learn from it, and how to apply these lessons wisely. Hours passed as she absorbed the vast array of information, drawing connections and insights. The flickering lamps seemed to respond to her attentiveness, illuminating the most critical lessons. Eleanor understood that mastery of the past was essential to navigate the present and prepare for the challenges ahead. Every observation strengthened her judgment, her awareness, and her understanding of the Brotherhood's mission. Finally, Eleanor stepped back, letting the warm glow of the lamps settle around her. She whispered softly to herself, "Every memory holds a lesson. Every lesson guides the future. I am ready to move forward." With renewed clarity, Eleanor prepared to leave the Chamber of Memory, carrying the wisdom of centuries with her as she advanced deeper into the hidden world of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor emerged from the Chamber of Memory into a vast hall, her senses alert to the magnitude of the space. At the far end stood an enormous central door, taller and more imposing than any she had previously encountered. Its surface was etched with symbols, geometric patterns, and sequences that seemed to merge all the lessons she had learned throughout her journey. Eleanor understood instantly that this was the threshold to the deepest heart of the Brotherhood, the place where knowledge, wisdom, and moral judgment were tested to their ultimate extent. She approached the door carefully, examining the intricate carvings, symbols from the mirror room, the shadow bridge, the silent corridor, and even the patterns she had studied in the Chamber of Memory were embedded here. The Brotherhood had designed this door to be a culmination of her journey, ensuring that only those who had truly integrated intellect, perception, and moral clarity could proceed. Eleanor traced her fingers along the patterns, feeling the resonance of the centuries-old design beneath her touch. The door seemed alive, reacting subtly to her understanding, testing her attentiveness, and challenging her to synthesize everything she had learned. Every mark, every curve, every symbol required deliberate observation and insight. She paused to recall the lessons of previous trials. The forests had taught patience and survival. The ruins had demanded observation and deduction. The mirror room required reflection of self. The shadow bridge had tested courage and balance. The darkness had trained intuition. The inner sanctum revealed structure and purpose. The invisible corridor and silent corridor refined precision and awareness. The Chamber of Echoes had strengthened focus, and the Chamber of Memory imparted the lessons of history. Now, all these experiences converged in this single challenge. Eleanor knelt before the central panel, aligning symbols from her key, the manuscripts, and her observations. The patterns responded incrementally, glowing faintly, indicating partial alignment. She realized that the process would require both meticulous reasoning and intuitive leaps. She moved with deliberate care, adjusting sequences, observing the door's subtle reactions, and harmonizing each element with her cumulative knowledge. Hours passed in concentrated effort. Eleanor could feel the weight of the Brotherhood's design pressing upon her, yet she remained steady. Her mind, body, and judgment were fully engaged. The door required the integration of intellect, observation, moral clarity, and patience, the essence of everything she had learned. Finally, a resonant hum filled the hall. The symbols glowed in perfect alignment, and the central door began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it opened, revealing darkness beyond, a space untouched and concealed for centuries. Eleanor's heart pounded with anticipation and awe. She had passed the ultimate threshold, demonstrating mastery of every lesson the Brotherhood had imparted. She whispered softly to herself, "Every trial, every lesson, every choice has led me here. I am ready for what lies beyond." Eleanor stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the central door, prepared to face the deepest mysteries and hidden knowledge of the Brotherhood of the Veil. Eleanor stepped into the final chamber, her breath catching at the sight before her. The room was immense, its walls lined with ancient inscriptions, glowing softly with an ethereal light. In the center lay a pedestal holding a large tome, bound in leather and inscribed with gold symbols. Around the chamber were artifacts, maps, and instruments, each representing centuries of the Brotherhood's work. She realized immediately that this was the heart of the organization, the place where all its secrets, purpose, and history converged. The tome opened almost of its own accord, revealing pages filled with knowledge, strategies, and reflections that documented not just events, but the philosophy guiding the Brotherhood. Eleanor absorbed the words carefully, understanding that the organization's mission had always been preservation, guidance, and moral stewardship. Their influence had shaped history quietly, subtly, yet with a commitment to ethical responsibility and the betterment of humanity. Eleanor walked slowly around the chamber, examining each artifact and inscription. Every object told a story of careful intervention, deliberate study, and disciplined practice. She recognized the continuity of the Brotherhood's work. Each generation trained the next, preserving knowledge while testing the integrity, intelligence, and judgment of those who sought its deepest secrets. As she studied, a subtle warmth filled the room, and a soft hum resonated from the walls, almost as if acknowledging her understanding. Eleanor realized that she had reached not only the center of the Brotherhood, but also the culmination of her own journey. Every trial, every chamber, every lesson had prepared her to comprehend this truth. Knowledge alone was insufficient without wisdom, patience, and moral clarity. The light from the inscriptions revealed hidden layers of meaning in the artifacts and symbols. Eleanor traced them with her hands, seeing how ethics, strategy, observation, and patience intertwined to form the foundation of the Brotherhood. Each challenge she had faced: the forests, ruins, mirror room, shadow, bridge, darkness, inner sanctum, invisible corridor, silent corridor, chamber of echoes, chamber of memory, and central door was now understood as a step toward this understanding. Finally, Eleanor closed the tome gently and looked around the chamber. She felt a profound sense of clarity, responsibility, and purpose. The Brotherhood's secrets were not meant for domination, but for protection, guidance, and the careful application of knowledge. She understood her own role now: to carry the lessons forward, to act wisely, and to honor the responsibility that knowledge demanded. Eleanor whispered softly to herself, "I have seen the truth. I have learned the lessons. Now, it is my duty to move forward with understanding and care." With that, she turned and stepped out of the chamber, leaving the heart of the Brotherhood behind, but carrying its wisdom with her. She emerged into the world anew, alert, perceptive, and guided by the knowledge and ethical clarity she had gained. Eleanor's journey through the Brotherhood of the Veil had reached its conclusion, but the responsibility and understanding she now possessed would guide every step she took beyond this secret realm. The chamber remained behind her, silent yet alive with the echoes of centuries, awaiting the next seeker worthy of its truths.